Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The cold always comes first, not the touch itself, but the anticipation of it. A creeping chill that seeps through my bedroom walls at exactly 3:06 a.m., like winter breath against warm skin. I've learned to recognize the signs now, after 3 weeks of this ritual. The house settles differently in those moments before, as if something heavy is redistributing its weight across the floorboards above my head. The heating system clicks off with mechanical precision, leaving only the ambient hum of the city filtering through double-paned windows. Then comes 3:07. The finger appears against my shoulder blade with the temperature of morning frost, pressing down just enough to register against my consciousness, but light enough to question whether I'm imagining it. Tonight, like every night for 21 consecutive occurrences, I count the taps. 1, 2, 3. Each contact lasting exactly 1.2 seconds with 0.8 second intervals between them. I know because I've measured. My name is Marcus, and I've spent 15 years capturing sounds that others can't hear. Studio work mostly, isolating the whisper of bow against violin strings, the intake of breath before a vocal run, the way room tone shifts when someone enters a space. My ears are trained instruments, calibrated to detect frequencies that exist in the margins of human perception. When this started happening, I approached it the same way I approach any audio phenomenon, with methodical documentation and professional skepticism. The watch on my nightstand shows 3:07, its hands frozen at those exact positions. Not stopped, frozen. The second hand quivers slightly as if struggling against some invisible resistance, but it never advances. I've replaced the battery 4 times. I've taken it to 3 different repair shops. Each technician tells me the same thing. The mechanism is perfect, the battery full, the quartz movement functioning exactly as designed. Yet every morning I wake to find it stuck at 3:07, and every evening it resumes normal operation. I slide my hand across the mattress to the recording equipment I've positioned on the nightstand. A Neumann U67 microphone connected to a Zoom F8N field recorder, both pieces of gear worth more than most people's cars. If something is touching me, these devices will capture it. They capture everything else. The neighbor's cat padding across the roof, the refrigerator cycling on 2 rooms away, my own heartbeat transmitted through the mattress springs. The finger lifts away after the 3rd tap, and I activate the recorder with muscle memory born from countless late-night sessions. The LED display glows green in the darkness, confirming 24-bit 96 kHz capture. Professional grade. Studio quality. If there's something here to document, this setup will find it. But as I lie still in the artificial silence that follows 3:07, another awareness creeps into my consciousness, something that exists beyond the realm of microphones and frequency analysis. A presence that seems to fill the negative space of my bedroom, like a person-shaped absence in the air itself. I can feel it watching, not with eyes but with something deeper, something that knows the rhythm of my thoughts before I think them. The sensation first appeared alongside the finger, but it's grown stronger each night, more invasive. Sometimes I catch myself holding my breath, afraid that even my respiration might reveal too much to whatever shares this space. Other times I find myself breathing deliberately, as if performing for an invisible audience that hangs on every intake and exhalation. Sleep becomes impossible after 3:07. I've learned this through trial and error, so I use the hours until dawn for analysis. My home studio occupies the spare bedroom, transformed into an acoustic chamber with bass traps and diffusion panels that cost me 3 months of freelance work. Here, surrounded by monitors and mixing boards and enough processing power to isolate a whisper from a thunderstorm, I examine each night's recording with forensic precision. The first week yielded nothing unusual. Standard room tone, the occasional street noise, my own movements against cotton sheets. But starting with the 8th recording, I began noticing subtle variations in the ambient sound. microscopic shifts in air pressure that registered only when I amplified the signal by 40 dB and applied high-pass filtering. At first, I dismissed these as electrical interference or environmental factors. The building settling, thermal expansion, vibrations from passing traffic. Then I isolated something that made my skin contract with recognition. Breathing. Not mine. I was holding my breath during these segments, afraid to contaminate the recording. This was different, deeper, slower. A respiratory pattern that seemed to match my own resting rate so perfectly that I initially missed it beneath my natural rhythm. Only when I compared the waveforms side by side did the synchronization become apparent. When my breathing accelerated, the unknown respiration followed within half a second. When I held my breath, it paused. When I resumed, it resumed. Something was breathing with me, in perfect mimicry of my own biological rhythms. I spent the next several nights conducting controlled experiments, varying my breathing patterns, holding my breath for extended periods, hyperventilating until my vision spotted. Each time, the secondary respiratory signature adapted to match. When I breathed fast, it breathed fast. When I slowed my rate to 4 breaths per minute through meditation techniques, the presence slowed with me. The correlation coefficient measured 0.97, nearly perfect synchronization. The technical impossibility of this discovery should have provided comfort. Audio hallucinations, perhaps, or psychosomatic manifestations of stress. Sleep deprivation playing tricks with pattern recognition systems in my trained ear. But the recordings don't lie. Digital audio at this resolution captures objective reality, free from subjective interpretation. Whatever was breathing with me existed in actual air molecules, creating actual pressure variations that my equipment could measure and quantify. I began expanding my monitoring setup. 3 additional microphones positioned around the room, creating a triangulated capture field that could isolate point sources in 3-dimensional space. A thermal imaging camera borrowed from a documentary cinematographer friend. EMF detectors typically used by electricians to locate wiring problems. If something was sharing my space, I would document every aspect of its presence. The results defied rational explanation. The breathing always originated from the same location, approximately 3 feet to the right of my bed, at chest height, as if something was standing there in perfect stillness. The thermal camera showed no heat signature. The EMF detectors registered no electromagnetic disturbance, but the audio evidence remained consistent. Respiration that matched my own with mechanical precision, captured by 4 independent microphones, processed through separate preamps, recorded to isolated channels. I started mapping the breathing patterns across multiple nights, looking for variations or inconsistencies that might reveal the phenomenon's true nature. Instead, I discovered something more unsettling. The synchronization was improving. What began as approximate mimicry had evolved into perfect harmonic matching. Not just the rhythm, but the depth, the length of inhalations, even the tiny pause that occurs between exhale and the next intake. Whatever was breathing with me was learning my body's specific patterns with increasing accuracy. Sleep became a battlefield where I fought against my own autonomic nervous system. Each night at 3:07, I would lie motionless while something studied the most intimate aspects of my existence, the involuntary processes that keep me alive. My breathing felt exposed, violated, as if someone was reading my diary written in oxygen and carbon dioxide. The finger taps took on new significance under this scrutiny. 3 taps, always 3, like a greeting or announcement. A signal that the observation period was beginning. I started responding with my own taps against the mattress, creating a crude communication system. When I tapped twice, the breathing pattern would shift slightly, becoming more deliberate. When I tapped 4 times, it would pause for exactly the duration of my tapping sequence before resuming. This interaction terrified me more than passive observation. It suggested consciousness, intention, the ability to interpret and respond to stimuli. Whatever shared my 3:07 a.m. space was not merely recording my breathing, it was engaging with me. I considered moving to a hotel, sleeping somewhere else, breaking the pattern through geographical relocation. But professional curiosity overrode personal comfort. This phenomenon represented the kind of acoustic mystery that sound engineers dream about discovering. I was documenting something unprecedented, possibly revolutionary. The scientific implications alone justified the psychological discomfort. The 20th night brought a breakthrough that shattered my remaining objectivity. I had positioned myself differently in bed, lying on my side instead of my back, deliberately altering my respiratory mechanics to see how the presence would adapt. At 3:07, the familiar finger delivered its 3 taps, but this time I felt the cold touch through my shirt, directly against my skin. The contact lasted longer, nearly 2 seconds, and seemed to pulse with a rhythm I recognized but couldn't immediately place. Then I understood. The pulsing matched my heartbeat. The breathing synchronization had been disturbing enough, but this represented a deeper level of biological monitoring. My heart rate, the most fundamental rhythm of my existence, was somehow being detected and replicated through that single point of contact. I lay perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to think, while something systematically cataloged the core functions of my living body. The recording from that night revealed even more troubling details when I analyzed it the following morning. Beneath the synchronized breathing, nearly lost in the noise floor, I detected a third audio signature. Faint but unmistakable, a rhythmic thumping at 72 beats per minute. My resting heart rate. 3 aspects of my biology were now being monitored and mimicked: breathing, heartbeat, and through some mechanism I couldn't understand, even my brainwaves seemed to be influencing the presence's behavior. When I concentrated on mathematical problems, the breathing became more regular, more controlled. When I let my mind wander into emotional territories, the rhythm became more organic, more human. I was being studied with scientific thoroughness by something that had no right to exist. The 21st night, tonight, I prepared for a more aggressive experiment. Instead of passive observation, I decided to initiate direct contact. I armed myself with a flashlight, a voice recorder, and enough caffeine to maintain hypervigilance through the post-3:07 period. When the finger touched my shoulder, I would sit up immediately, turn on the light, and attempt visual confirmation of whatever shared my space. The cold sensation arrived on schedule at 3:06, that familiar prelude that set my nerves on edge. I counted down the seconds, preparing for action. 3:07 approached with the inevitability of sunrise. The finger touched my shoulder. 1, 2, 3. I snapped upright and activated the flashlight in a single motion, sweeping the beam across the area where the breathing always originated. The light illuminated nothing but empty air and the far wall of my bedroom. But the cold hadn't left my shoulder. If anything, it had intensified, spreading down my arm like frostbite in fast motion. I aimed the voice recorder toward the empty space and asked aloud what it wanted, why it was here, what it was learning from its nightly observations. My words fell into silence so complete that I could hear my own blood moving through my veins. Even the ambient city noise seemed muted, as if the world outside had paused to listen. Then, through the monitors in my studio next door, I heard something that made my rational mind crumble. My own voice, speaking the same questions I had just asked, but with subtle differences in cadence and emphasis. The words were identical, but the delivery was wrong. Too measured, too deliberate, like someone reading lines from a script they didn't fully understand. The voice was coming from the empty space 3 feet to my right, exactly where the breathing always originated. I played the recording back immediately, my hands shaking as I operated the controls. My original questions were there, clear and unmistakable, but the responses, my own voice answering back, were absent from the digital record. The audio showed only my questions followed by silence, as if I had been talking to myself in an empty room. Yet I had heard the responses with perfect clarity, my voice, my words, but spoken by something else. The cold finally lifted from my shoulder as the first hint of dawn appeared at my window. The watch on my nightstand resumed its normal operation with a soft tick that sounded abnormally loud after hours of supernatural silence. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the recording equipment that had failed to capture the most significant audio event of my career. Either I was losing my mind with unprecedented specificity, experiencing auditory hallucinations that perfectly mimicked my professional expertise while leaving my technical knowledge intact, or something impossible was studying me with methods that existed outside the boundaries of recordable reality. Both options terrified me equally. As daylight strengthened and the normal sounds of morning traffic began filtering through my windows, I found myself listening to my own breathing with new awareness. Each inhalation felt monitored, each exhalation analyzed and cataloged by an intelligence that had learned to perfectly imitate the most fundamental processes of my existence. Tonight is the 22nd night. I'm writing this while it's still daylight, while I can still think clearly without the oppressive presence that arrives at 3:07. In a few hours, I'll return to my bed, set up my recording equipment, and wait for the familiar cold to announce another session of biological surveillance. But I'm beginning to suspect that whatever visits me isn't learning how to mimic my body's functions. It's learning how to be me. The synchronization isn't observation, it's preparation. The question that keeps me awake, even during daylight hours, is simple. What happens when it's finished learning? The watch on my desk shows 2:47 p.m., ticking forward with normal mechanical precision. In 12 hours and 20 minutes, I'll find out if I'm losing my mind or losing something far more fundamental. Something that breathes when I breathe, beats when my heart beats, and speaks with my voice when no one should be listening. Something that knows me better than I know myself. Something that might be getting ready to prove it. Story 2. The first time my phone's GPS led me to the dead-end alley, I assumed it was a glitch. Technology fails, servers crash, satellites lose signal, occupational hazards of being an IT consultant. But when the mechanical voice insisted for the third time that I had arrived at my destination, while staring at nothing but overgrown ivy and a corroded metal sign reading, "Come back tomorrow," something cold settled in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. The Kappa Sigma house loomed behind me, its Victorian bones draped in shadows that seemed to breathe with the evening wind. I'd accepted the overnight arrangement reluctantly. The client meeting had run late. Local hotels were booked solid due to some homecoming weekend, and my contact assured me the old fraternity house still maintained guest quarters for university visitors. What he hadn't mentioned was how the building seemed to exhale decades of accumulated secrets through its weathered clapboard siding. I thumb-typed the address again, triple-checking each digit against the email confirmation. The phone's screen glowed with confident certainty. 1247 Elm Street. This was 1247 Elm Street. But this narrow passage between buildings, barely wide enough for a single person, couldn't possibly house anything larger than the shadows that pooled between its brick walls like black syrup. The metal sign hung at eye level, suspended from a single rusty chain that clinked softly in the breeze. The lettering had been stamped with industrial precision decades ago, but weather had eaten away at its edges, leaving the words slightly blurred, as if viewed through old glass. "Come back tomorrow." Not closed or no entry. An invitation deferred, a promise postponed. I backed out of the alley, the sensation of unseen eyes tracking my movement making the hair on my arm stand at attention. The street stretched empty in both directions, lined with century-old maples whose branches formed a canopy so thick it filtered the streetlight into pale, dancing patches. My rental car sat precisely where I'd left it, but something about its positioning seemed wrong. Not the angle I remembered, perhaps a few inches closer to the curb. The Kappa Sigma house dominated the corner lot like a brooding patriarch, its 3 stories of bay windows and gingerbread trim casting complex shadows that shifted with each gust of wind. A wraparound porch embraced the ground floor, its railing dotted with empty planters that might have held flowers once but now cradled only dried leaves and spider webs. The front door, a massive oak panel with stained glass insets, stood slightly ajar, spilling warm yellow light onto the porch boards. Marcus Hendricks, the university's facilities coordinator, had met me there an hour earlier with an apologetic smile and a ring of keys that jangled like wind chimes. The house served as overflow accommodations for visiting faculty and guest lecturers, he'd explained while leading me through rooms that smelled of old wood polish and decades of pipe tobacco. My quarters were on the second floor, a modest bedroom with a single bed, a writing desk, and a window that looked out onto the same street where my GPS had 3 times insisted on delivering me to nowhere. Just so you know, Marcus had mentioned while demonstrating the antique radiator's quirky controls, the building settles at night. Old houses, you know. The wood expands and contracts. You might hear some creaking, especially around midnight when the temperature drops. I'd nodded and thanked him, accustomed to the peculiarities of old buildings from years of traveling to client sites. But settling wood doesn't usually sound like footsteps. It doesn't pause at regular intervals, as if someone were testing each floorboard for stability, and it certainly doesn't seem to respond to movement, growing more pronounced when you shift position in bed, falling silent when you hold your breath and listen. The first night, I'd attributed the sounds to standard old house acoustics, pipes expanding, joints flexing, mice in the walls. But by the second night, the creaking had developed a rhythm, a deliberate cadence that suggested intention rather than physics. It began precisely at 11:47 p.m., according to the red digits of the bedside clock, with a long, drawn-out groan that seemed to originate from somewhere below my room. Not the basement. I'd explored the lower level during my arrival tour, but from some intermediate space, as if the sound emerged from within the walls themselves. Tonight marked my 3rd evening in the house, and I found myself checking the time obsessively as the minutes crawled toward midnight. The client meeting had concluded successfully that afternoon, my contract fulfilled with handshakes and signed documents. I should have been packing, preparing for tomorrow's early flight home. Instead, I sat at the writing desk, laptop closed, staring at my phone's GPS app with growing unease. The street map displayed with digital precision, each building clearly delineated, every address properly marked. But when I traced the route from the Kappa Sigma house to 1247 Elm Street, the blue line led directly to that narrow alley, that impossible dead end with its cryptic metal sign. According to my phone's satellite imagery, the alley didn't exist. The space appeared occupied by the side wall of the adjacent building, solid brick extending from sidewalk to roofline without interruption. I'd visited the alley again that afternoon, approaching this time on foot rather than by car. The narrow passage remained exactly as I'd found it. Ivy-draped walls, scattered leaves, the corroded sign hanging from its solitary chain. But when I held up my phone to photograph the space, the camera displayed only the blank brick wall I'd seen in the satellite view. The screen showed no alley, no sign, no shadows pooled between buildings like spilled ink. The phone's clock read 11:45 p.m. I closed the laptop and moved to the window, peering down at the street below. Elm Street stretched away in both directions, empty except for the pools of amber light cast by antique lampposts. The alley, if it existed, if my eyes weren't fabricating what my phone's camera couldn't capture, lay just beyond my line of sight, hidden behind the thick trunk of a massive oak. 11:46 p.m. The anticipation felt like insects crawling beneath my skin. I pressed my palms against the cool window glass, watching my breath fog the surface in small, irregular clouds. Somewhere in the house below, a door closed softly, followed by the whisper of footsteps on carpet. Another guest, perhaps, or the night security guard Marcus had mentioned in passing. The sounds were comforting in their humanity, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this oversized mausoleum. 11:47 p.m. The creaking began. Not the random pops and groans of thermal expansion, but something far more deliberate. A long, sustained protest of wood under pressure, as if an enormous door were being opened with excruciating slowness. The sound seemed to rise from beneath the floorboards, filling the room with its presence until the very air vibrated with wooden complaint. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The creaking continued, joined now by a second sound, metal against metal, the tortured squeal of hinges that hadn't tasted oil in decades. But this house had no basement door, no massive entryway that could produce such sounds. I'd explored every accessible room, every corridor and staircase. The architecture held no secrets, No hidden chambers or forgotten passages. The sounds peaked, then began to fade, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt oppressive. But underneath that silence, barely audible yet unmistakably present, came the whisper of footsteps on what might have been gravel, or might have been dried leaves, or might have been something else entirely. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the front door. The lobby lay in darkness except for a single table lamp that cast nervous shadows across the antique furniture. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors despite my attempts at stealth, each board betraying my passage with tiny protests that seemed unnaturally loud in the midnight stillness. The front door stood exactly as Marcus had left it, locked but not bolted, easy enough to open from the inside. The October air bit at my exposed skin as I stepped onto the porch, carrying with it the scent of decomposing leaves and something else, something metallic and cold that made my sinuses ache. The street stretched away in both directions, empty and patient, waiting for something that might never come. I walked toward the corner where Elm Street intersected with Maple, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves that carpeted the sidewalk. The alley should be visible from this angle, tucked between the old pharmacy building and what appeared to be a disused office space. But when I reached the intersection and turned to look back, I saw only the unbroken facade of brick and mortar, windows dark as empty eye sockets. Yet I could feel it, the pull of that narrow passage, the certainty that it existed despite my eyes' insistence otherwise. I retraced my steps, moving slowly along the building's perimeter, running my hands along the brick wall until my fingers found the space between buildings, the gap that shouldn't exist but did. The alley yawned before me, darker than the surrounding shadows, as if it absorbed light rather than merely blocking it. The metal sign hung motionless now, its message unchanged. Come back tomorrow. But underneath the stamped lettering, barely visible in the pale streetlight, additional words had been scratched into the metal with something sharp. Fresh scratches, the edges still bright where the tool had scraped away oxidation. The door waits below. I backed away from the alley, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps that clouded the air like small ghosts. The scratched words hadn't been there during my previous visits. I was certain of that. Someone had added them recently, perhaps tonight, perhaps while I sat in my room listening to the impossible sounds of a door that couldn't exist. The walk back to the Kappa Sigma house felt longer than it should have, as if the street were stretching beneath my feet like taffy. Every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. Every rustling leaf suggested movement that had nothing to do with wind. The house welcomed me back with its warm light and familiar creaks, but even its supposed comfort felt tainted now, contaminated by the knowledge that somewhere beneath my feet, something was waiting. I climbed the stairs to my room, each step producing sounds that seemed to echo far longer than physics should allow. The hallway stretched ahead of me, lined with doors to empty rooms that I'd never bothered to explore. Behind each door might be anything, more guest quarters, storage spaces, or passages that led to places not marked on any architectural plan. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my phone. The GPS app still insisted that 1247 Elm Street was a real place, still drew its confident blue line from my current location to that impossible alley. But now, when I zoomed in on the satellite imagery, I could see something I'd missed before. A faint depression in the ground where the alley should be. A subtle shadow that suggested depth rather than level ground, as if something lay beneath the street, something large enough to create a cavity in the earth above it. 11:47 p.m. approached again, and I realized with growing dread that the sounds I'd been hearing weren't coming from below at all. They were coming from above, from somewhere beyond the ceiling, from a space that, according to the house's layout, shouldn't exist. The third floor contained only storage areas and a small attic, Marcus had explained. Nothing large enough to house whatever was producing these sounds. The creaking began anew, and this time I could trace its progress across the ceiling, slow, deliberate movement from one side of the room to the other, as if something immense were being dragged across wooden planks. The sound of those ancient hinges followed, metal screaming against metal in protest of movement, and then, clear as a whisper in my ear, came the sound of footsteps on gravel. But I was on the second floor. There was no gravel above me, no pathway where those footsteps could fall. Yet the sound persisted, growing closer, until it seemed the walker must be standing directly overhead, separated from me by only a few inches of plaster and wood. I grabbed my laptop bag and headed for the door, my hands shaking as I turned the handle. The hallway beyond lay in perfect silence, empty and waiting. But as I stepped into the corridor, I heard another sound, the soft whisper of an opening door, somewhere in the house below. Someone was entering the building, or something was leaving it. I descended the stairs as quietly as I could manage, wincing at every creak that betrayed my movement. The lobby stretched before me, bathed in the same pale light that had greeted my return from the street. But now the front door stood wide open, swinging gently in the night breeze, spilling autumn air across the hardwood floors. I approached the threshold cautiously, peering out into the darkness beyond. The street appeared empty, but the feeling of being watched pressed against my skin like cold fingers. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the whisper of wind through dead leaves, came the sound of footsteps on gravel, growing fainter with each passing second. I pulled the door closed and turned the deadbolt, then climbed back to my room to pack. Whatever was happening in this place, whether supernatural manifestation or elaborate psychological manipulation, I'd had enough. Morning couldn't come soon enough, and with it, my flight home to a world where GPS systems didn't lie and doors didn't open onto impossible spaces. But as I folded clothes into my suitcase, I found myself checking the window obsessively, drawn to scan the street below for signs of movement. The alley remained invisible from this angle, hidden behind the oak tree's massive trunk, but I could feel its presence like a magnetic pull. Whatever lay beneath that narrow passage, whatever door waited in the darkness below the street, it knew I was here. It had been calling to me through the wooden voice of this old house, drawing me closer with each passing night. The scratched words on the metal sign echoed in my memory. The door waits below. But what door? And what lay beyond it? I closed the suitcase and sat on the bed, staring at my phone's GPS app. The blue line still stretched from my current location to 1247 Elm Street, still insisted that the alley was a real place worthy of navigation. But now, as I watched, the line began to pulse gently, like a heartbeat, like something alive and patient and utterly certain that sooner or later I would follow it home. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow I would leave this place behind, return to my life of servers and networks, and problems that could be solved with logic and technical expertise. Tomorrow I would be somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere that doors didn't creak open onto impossible spaces and GPS systems didn't guide travelers to places that existed only in the gaps between what was real and what was possible. But tonight, as the clock approached 11:47 once more, and the familiar sounds began their wooden symphony above my head, I found myself wondering if tomorrow was just another postponement, another promise deferred. The door below was waiting, patient as stone, certain as gravity, and with each passing moment, I could feel its pull growing stronger, drawing me toward whatever lay hidden beneath the surface of this quiet college town. The question was no longer whether I would go to it. The question was whether I could resist long enough to see another dawn. Story 3. The camera never lies. That's what I used to tell my clients. 3 decades of wedding photography, corporate headshots, and the occasional art exhibition had taught me to trust the lens above all else. Light reveals truth, shadows conceal it, and somewhere between the two lies reality. But that was before Maple Street taught me that some truths are better left undeveloped. The evening started like any other Tuesday. I'd been reviewing proofs from the Morrison wedding when the streetlights outside my window began their dance. One by one, they flickered to life in perfect sequence, starting from the corner where Cedar intersects Maple and moving steadily toward my house. Each lamp held its glow for exactly 3 seconds before passing the torch to the next, creating a river of light that flowed directly to my front door. I pressed my face against the cool glass, watching this impossible choreography unfold. Streetlights don't work that way. They operate on timers, photocells, manual switches. not some ethereal conductor orchestrating a symphony of illumination. Yet there it was, undeniable as the weight of my Nikon hanging around my neck. The sequence repeated twice more before the street returned to its normal scattered glow. I grabbed my camera, fingers moving with practiced precision across familiar controls. But the lights had already resumed their mundane patterns. The only evidence of what I'd witnessed was the metallic taste of adrenaline coating my tongue, and the unsettling certainty that something had just marked my house as a destination. Sleep proved elusive that night. Every creak of settling timber, every whisper of wind through the old oak outside my bedroom, seemed amplified and deliberate. I found myself cataloging sounds the way I cataloged light, searching for patterns, for meaning in the chaos of an old house breathing through the darkness. The first beam appeared at 3:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I'd been staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between my heartbeats, when a column of pure white light pierced through my living room window. It moved with purpose, sweeping across the hardwood floors like a lighthouse beacon, but its source remained invisible beyond the glass. I crept downstairs, bare feet silent on the cold wood, and positioned myself where I could observe without being seen. The beam continued its methodical exploration, pausing at specific points along the walls before moving on. When it reached the space above my mantelpiece, it stopped entirely. Geometric symbols began materializing in the light's wake, perfect triangles intersected by circles, hexagons nested within pentagons, mathematical precision rendered in what appeared to be phosphorescent ink. The designs pulsed with their own internal rhythm, growing brighter with each cycle until they seared themselves into my retinas. Then the light vanished, leaving only the fluorescent afterglow of those impossible symbols painted across my walls. I turned on every lamp in the house, desperate to wash away the alien geometry with familiar illumination, but the symbols remained visible, faint green traces that seemed to mock the inadequacy of my ordinary bulbs. I photographed them from every angle, adjusting exposure and ISO settings to capture their ethereal luminescence, but the camera saw only blank walls. The symbols existed in a spectrum beyond digital sensors, beyond anything I understood about light and shadow. Dawn brought temporary relief. The symbols faded with the rising sun, becoming invisible ghosts that I could feel watching from the walls but could no longer see. I convinced myself it had been a dream, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many late nights and too much caffeine. The human mind, I rationalized, could project remarkably vivid imagery when pushed beyond its limits. But the next morning, the symbols had moved. The triangle that had appeared near the window was now positioned above the doorway to my kitchen. The nested hexagons had migrated to the opposite wall, rotated 90 degrees counterclockwise. It was as if invisible hands had spent the night rearranging furniture in dimensions I couldn't perceive. I began keeping a detailed log, sketching the positions and orientations of each symbol, measuring distances between formations with a carpenter's tape. The patterns defied any mathematical logic I could discern, yet they felt purposeful, pieces of a vast puzzle assembling themselves one dawn at a time. The neighbors noticed my deteriorating condition before I did. Mrs. Chen mentioned that I'd been leaving my porch light on all night, something I had no memory of doing. The Hendersons asked if I was feeling well, noting the dark circles under my eyes and my increasingly disheveled appearance. I assured them I was fine, just working on a challenging project that demanded unusual hours. The truth was, I'd stopped sleeping entirely. Every night brought new visitations. The beam grew bolder, lingering longer in each room, adding complexity to its cryptic artwork. My house became a canvas for something that spoke in mathematical languages I couldn't comprehend. I tried everything, covering the windows with blackout curtains, installing motion sensor lights in my yard, even sleeping with all the interior lights blazing. But the beam penetrated every barrier, as if darkness and light were mere suggestions rather than physical laws. 3 weeks into this nightly ritual, I noticed the other houses on Maple Street had begun exhibiting their own subtle anomalies. The Patel family's garage door opened and closed at precisely 2:45 a.m. each night. The elderly Mr. Kowalski's television cast blue flickering patterns against his bedroom ceiling long after his usual bedtime. Even the stray cats had changed their behavior. gathering in perfect circles beneath the streetlights, as if attending some feline council of war. The realization crept over me slowly, like ice water seeping through a cracked foundation. I wasn't the only one being visited. Whatever had begun with that initial cascade of streetlights had spread throughout the neighborhood, marking each house with its own unique signature of strangeness. But my house remained the terminus, the final destination of that first light parade. I started researching the history of Maple Street, spending hours at the local library, poring over property records and newspaper archives. The neighborhood was built in 1952 on land that had previously housed a defunct observatory. The facility had been abandoned in the 1940s after a series of unexplained equipment failures and what the papers euphemistically called personnel difficulties. One article, buried in the archives of the local Gazette, mentioned an astronomer named Dr. Helena Voss who had been conducting experiments in geometric light projection at the observatory before its closure. Her work, according to the brief description, involved using focused beams to create mathematical models in three-dimensional space. The article was dated October 31, 1947, and was followed by no further coverage of her research. I found Dr. Voss's personal papers in the university's special collections, donated by her estate decades after her death. Her notebooks were filled with intricate diagrams that made my blood freeze, geometric patterns identical to those appearing on my walls. But her notes suggested these weren't mere decorative designs. They were coordinates, mapping points in space according to principles that existed outside conventional physics. Her final entry, dated 3 days before the observatory's closure, was written in increasingly erratic handwriting. The patterns are responding. They move independently now, repositioning themselves according to calculations I cannot follow. The light has become self-aware, learning to navigate our reality through geometric breadcrumbs. I fear I have opened a door that was meant to remain closed. The notebook ended there, but included with the papers was a hand-drawn map of the surrounding area. Maple Street was clearly marked, with my exact address circled in red ink and annotated with a single word: confluence. That night, I positioned myself in my living room with every camera I owned, determined to document whatever was happening to me with scientific precision. If I was losing my mind, at least I could create a record of my descent into madness. If something genuinely supernatural was occurring, I would have proof. The beam arrived precisely at 3:17 a.m., as it had every night for the past month. But this time, I was ready. I photographed everything: the light's entry through my windows, its methodical sweep across each room, the moment of symbol creation. My camera fired continuously, motor drive whirring in the darkness, capturing frame after frame of impossible luminescence. But when I reviewed the images the next morning, every single photograph showed the same thing: an empty room, bathed in ordinary darkness, with no trace of the supernatural geometry that had been searing itself into my vision just hours before. The symbols themselves had evolved overnight. They now covered every wall in my house, overlapping and intersecting in patterns so complex they hurt to look at directly. Some seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, while others moved with barely perceptible fluidity, like living mathematical equations solving themselves in real time. And for the first time since this began, I could see them clearly in daylight. I called in sick to work and spent the day tracing the patterns with my finger, feeling for texture that wasn't there, searching for some tactile confirmation that what I was experiencing had substance beyond my deteriorating perception. The symbols felt warm to the touch, radiating a subtle heat that penetrated through my skin and settled in my bones. As evening approached, I made a decision that I knew would change everything. I would be outside when the streetlights began their sequence, positioned to see where the beam originated. At 11:43 p.m., I stood in my front yard, every sense heightened by anticipation and fear. The night air carried the scent of approaching rain and the distant sound of traffic on the interstate, normal sounds of a normal world that suddenly felt very far away. The streetlights began their dance at midnight exactly, but this time I could see the source. There, at the intersection of Cedar and Maple, stood a figure bathed in that impossible white light. The illumination seemed to emanate from within them, turning their body into a living lighthouse that conducted electricity through the metal veins of the street. I couldn't make out features or details. The light was too intense, too pure, but I could see them raising their arms in a gesture that was part benediction, part mathematical calculation. The beam that had been visiting my house wasn't coming from above or beyond. It was coming from them. As the final streetlight completed its cycle and normal illumination returned to Maple Street, the figure turned in my direction. Even across the distance, even through the blinding radiance that surrounded them, I felt their attention settle on me like a weight. They began walking toward my house. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was approaching through the darkness. But I found myself rooted in place, transfixed by the measured pace of their footsteps and the growing intensity of the light that surrounded them. They stopped at the edge of my property line, just beyond the reach of my porch light, and I finally understood what Dr. Voss had discovered in her geometric experiments. The symbols weren't random patterns or supernatural graffiti. They were a language, a form of communication that existed in the spaces between dimensions. And my house, built on the foundation of her former observatory, had become a receiving station for messages transmitted across vast gulfs of space and time. The figure raised one hand, and every symbol inside my house blazed to life simultaneously, visible even through the walls and windows, turning my entire home into a geometric constellation. They were no longer scattered patterns, but components of a single massive equation that my house had been slowly assembling night after night. And in that moment of blazing mathematical revelation, I realized the terrible truth. The symbols weren't just appearing in my house, they were appearing because of me. My presence, my observations, my very act of witnessing these impossible events had somehow become part of the calculation. I wasn't documenting the phenomenon, I was the phenomenon. The figure lowered their hand and began walking back toward the intersection, their light gradually dimming with each step. As they reached the corner where this had all begun, they turned once more in my direction, and I heard, not with my ears, but with some deeper sense I'd never known I possessed, a single word that bypassed language entirely and embedded itself directly into my consciousness. Continue. Then they were gone, leaving only the ordinary darkness of a suburban street and the weight of absolute certainty that tomorrow night, at 3:17 a.m., the beam would return. The symbols would continue their slow accumulation, adding new elements to their incomprehensible equation. And I would be here to witness it, because that's what I was now. Not a photographer capturing reality, but a component in a cosmic calculation that had been decades in the making. I walked back into my house and looked at the walls, now dark and seemingly empty in the aftermath of that blazing revelation. But I could feel them there, waiting in their fluorescent patience for dawn to render them invisible once again. The geometry of light and shadow that had defined my entire career suddenly seemed quaint and limited, a child's drawing compared to the mathematical languages being written across my walls. In my darkroom, surrounded by decades of captured moments and frozen time, I finally understood what Dr. Voss had learned in her final days at the observatory. Some truths are too large for human comprehension, too complex for our limited dimensional perspective. We can only experience them in fragments, piece by piece, night after night, until the pattern becomes clear enough to see the shape of something vast and patient and utterly alien using our reality as its canvas. The camera never lies, but sometimes it simply isn't sophisticated enough to capture the truth. And tomorrow night, when that pure white beam returns to continue its patient work, I'll be here to witness the next addition to an equation that began decades ago and may not reach its conclusion until long after I'm gone. Because I'm no longer just observing the phenomenon. I am the phenomenon. The streetlights outside my window flicker once, twice, and then settle into their normal patterns. But I know that at midnight, they'll begin their sequence again, counting down to another visitation, another layer of impossible geometry added to the growing map that my house has become. And I'll be watching, because that's what I do now. That's what I am. The geometry of light has made me its witness, and its witness I will remain. Story 4. The silence here isn't natural. It's the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums until you start hearing things that aren't there. Or maybe they are. And that's the problem. I came to the abandoned monastery 3 weeks ago, seeking digital detox and mental clarity after my third consecutive 70-hour work week. The tech startup where I debug code and troubleshoot server crashes had finally driven me to the edge of something I couldn't quite name. Burnout seemed too simple a diagnosis for the way my hands had started shaking when I touched a keyboard, or how I'd begun seeing error messages in my peripheral vision even when no screens were present. The monastery sits like a forgotten prayer on a hill 30 miles from civilization, its stone walls the color of dried blood in certain light. Brother Augustine, the elderly caretaker who handed me the keys before departing for his own vacation, mentioned that I'd be completely alone. The building had housed contemplative monks until 1987, when the last 3 brothers simply walked away, leaving behind their robes, their books, and according to local gossip, something else they couldn't name. My cell, that's what Brother Augustine called it, though it feels more like a room designed for someone much smaller than me, contains a narrow bed, a wooden desk, a chair that creaks with every movement, and a single window that frames nothing but empty hills. The walls are thick enough to muffle any external sound, which should be comforting but instead creates an acoustic vacuum, where every breath, every heartbeat, every joint that pops when I shift position becomes magnified. The first night, I fell asleep easily enough. Exhaustion will do that, even in an unfamiliar place that smells of old incense and something faintly medicinal I can't identify. I dreamed of nothing, or at least nothing I remembered upon waking. What I did find, scattered across my pillow like confetti from some invisible celebration, were delicate orange petals, tissue-thin and completely dry, as if they'd been pressed between the pages of a book for decades. I gathered them in my palm, breathing in their scent, bright and citrusy, but with an underlying note of something darker, like fruit that's been left too long in shadow. Brother Augustine had been clear. There were no fruit trees on the property. The nearest orange groves were over 100 miles south, in a completely different climate zone. Still, I wasn't particularly concerned. Old buildings accumulate strange things. Potpourri from previous visitors, perhaps, or dried flowers used in religious ceremonies decades ago, finally working their way out of cracks in the walls. I swept the petals into the wastebasket and went about my day. The monastery's daily rhythm is deceptively simple. I wake at sunrise, not by choice, but because the room brightens dramatically the moment the sun clears the eastern hills. I meditate. Badly. I walk the corridors, my footsteps echoing off stone walls lined with empty frames where religious paintings once hung. I read books from the small library Brother Augustine left accessible, mostly dense theological texts that make my head swim after a few pages. I eat simple meals from the provisions I brought. I sleep. But on the second night, something changed. I was lying in that space between consciousness and sleep when I felt the mattress shift. Not dramatically, just the subtle depression that happens when someone sits carefully on the edge of a bed, trying not to wake the person lying there. My eyes opened immediately, but I didn't move, didn't turn my head, barely allowed my breathing to change. The room was dark except for weak moonlight filtering through the small window, creating geometric shadows that seemed to pulse with my heartbeat. Then came the voice. It was barely above a whisper, positioned exactly where someone would sit on the bed beside my head, and it was telling a joke. Something about a programmer who walked into a bar and ordered 1.41421356 beers, and when the bartender looked confused, said he'd been working on square roots all day and needed to get radical. I remember thinking, even in my half-conscious state, that it was genuinely funny, clever in a way that suggested whoever was telling it understood both programming humor and mathematical wordplay. I wanted to turn over, to see who was there, but my body felt heavy, unresponsive. Not paralyzed exactly, but reluctant, as if some part of my brain was insisting that looking would be a mistake. The voice continued with another joke. This one about a debugger who was so good at finding problems that he started noticing glitches in reality itself. I found myself smiling, then almost laughing, but somehow I couldn't quite remember the punchline even as I was hearing it. The voice went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, telling joke after joke, each one perfectly crafted and genuinely amusing. I felt my mood lifting, stress draining from my shoulders, the knots in my mind loosening. It was the most relaxed I'd felt in months. When I woke the next morning, I was in an excellent mood for no reason I could articulate. The sun seemed brighter, the stone walls less oppressive. Even the creaking chair sounded musical rather than annoying. And there, scattered across my pillow, were more orange petals. More than the first night, and somehow fresher, as if they'd just been picked from a tree in full bloom. This time I didn't sweep them away immediately. I examined them more carefully, noting their perfect preservation despite their obvious age, the way they seemed to glow faintly in the morning light. I pressed one between my fingers and inhaled. The scent was stronger now, almost overwhelming, carrying hints of sunshine and rain and soil and something indefinably alive. I spent the day trying to remember the jokes I'd heard, but they slipped away like smoke every time I thought I had one. I could recall the rhythm of them, the cadence of the storytelling, the warm feeling of being entertained by a master comedian, but the actual words refused to stick. It was like trying to hold water in a colander. That evening, I found myself looking forward to bedtime in a way that felt both natural and strange. I arranged myself in the narrow bed, positioned my head on the pillow, and waited. Part of me expected nothing to happen. Surely whatever had occurred the previous night was a product of stress and unfamiliar surroundings. But another part of me, a part that had been growing stronger since I'd arrived at the monastery, knew with absolute certainty that my visitor would return. And they did. The mattress depression was more pronounced this time, as if my nocturnal companion was settling in for a longer stay. The jokes began immediately, flowing one into another with the confidence of a practiced performer. They were different from the night before, but equally clever. Observations about the absurdity of modern life delivered with perfect timing, wordplay that made me grin in the darkness, stories that built to unexpected punchlines that left me feeling genuinely delighted. But as the voice continued, I began to notice things that should have been impossible. The jokes referenced events from my own life, inside jokes from college that only my roommates would know, embarrassing moments from my childhood that I'd never told anyone, private thoughts I'd had about coworkers and friends. Yet they were told with such gentle humor, such obvious affection, that I felt no violation of privacy, only the warm recognition of being truly understood. The voice itself was becoming more familiar, though I still couldn't place it. Sometimes it sounded like my father who had died 5 years ago. Sometimes like my best friend from high school, whom I'd lost touch with after graduation. Sometimes like my own voice, but younger, more confident. The way I'd sounded before years of debugging other people's mistakes had worn down my faith in clean solutions. When morning came, I found orange petals not just on my pillow, but scattered across the entire bed, as if someone had been tossing them in the air while I slept. The scent filled the room, sweet and sharp and somehow nostalgic, triggering memories I couldn't quite grasp. Summer afternoons in a grandmother's garden I'd never had. The taste of fresh orange juice on Christmas mornings that felt more real than my actual childhood memories. I began to experiment. On the third night I tried staying fully awake, fighting off sleep to catch my visitor in the act. But consciousness seemed to be a requirement for the experience. The moment I was fully alert, listening intently in the darkness, nothing happened. I had to be in that liminal space between wake and sleep. That vulnerable state where the rational mind releases its grip and allows impossible things to feel perfectly normal. On the fourth night, I attempted to participate, to respond to the jokes or ask questions. But my voice wouldn't work. Or perhaps I was speaking and not making sound. Or perhaps sound was being made, but in frequencies I couldn't hear. The monologue continued regardless, uninterrupted, as if my mysterious comedian existed in a parallel dimension where communication flowed only one way. By the end of the first week, I was sleeping later into the morning, reluctant to leave the warmth of my bed and its lingering scent of orange blossoms. The jokes from the night before would echo in my head throughout the day, just out of reach, creating a constant background hum of almost remembered amusement. I found myself smiling at nothing, chuckling at private thoughts that weren't quite private anymore. The monastery's silence no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it seemed expectant, pregnant with possibility. During my walks through the corridors, I began to notice things that shouldn't have been there. Scuff marks on the floor that suggested recent foot traffic, doors that I was certain I'd left closed standing slightly ajar, the faint sound of laughter echoing from empty rooms when I paused to listen. I started leaving my cell door open at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of my visitor coming or going. But whatever was happening in my room seemed to exist outside normal space and time. There were never footprints in the hallway dust, never any sign that anyone had passed through the building except me. The jokes themselves began to change as the second week progressed. They became more personal, more specifically tailored to my current situation. Stories about tech workers who discovered that the bugs in their code were actually features in a larger program they couldn't see. Anecdotes about programmers who went on digital detoxes only to find that the real world was just another form of virtual reality, less reliable than the one they'd left behind. One night, the voice told a particularly elaborate joke about a systems analyst who thought he was debugging his life by isolating himself in an abandoned monastery, only to discover that he was actually a subroutine in someone else's meditation program. The punchline involved realizing that consciousness itself might be nothing more than an error message from a cosmic operating system trying to crash gracefully. I laughed so hard at that one that I woke myself up, sitting bolt upright in the darkness with the sound of my own laughter still echoing off the stone walls. The room was empty, silent, but the scent of orange blossoms was so strong it made my eyes water. When I touched my pillow, my hand came away sticky with what looked like fresh orange juice, though it evaporated even as I examined it, leaving behind only the faintest citrus residue. That morning, I found Brother Augustine's contact information and almost called him. Almost asked about the monastery's history, about previous guests, about whether anyone had ever reported unusual experiences. But what would I say? That I was being visited by an invisible comedian who told jokes I couldn't remember and left orange petals that shouldn't exist? That I was starting to look forward to bedtime more than I looked forward to waking up? Instead, I extended my stay. When I'd originally booked the retreat, I'd planned to spend 2 weeks finding mental clarity and returning to my job refreshed and focused. But now, sitting in my cell with orange-scented sunlight streaming through the window, the thought of going back to fluorescent offices and computer screens filled me with a dread so profound it made my stomach clench. The jokes were becoming a necessity, a nightly dose of something I couldn't name but desperately needed. They were filling a gap in my mind that I hadn't realized existed, satisfying a hunger I'd carried for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be fed. The laughter, or the memory of laughter, since I could never quite recall the moment of amusement itself, was rewiring something fundamental in my brain, creating new pathways that made the world seem lighter, more bearable, more fundamentally absurd in a way that was comforting rather than threatening. But as the third week began, I started to notice changes that were harder to dismiss as products of imagination or isolation-induced hallucinations. The orange petals were appearing during the day now, materializing on surfaces I was actively watching. I'd be reading at the wooden desk and suddenly notice a petal resting on the page I was reading, perfectly positioned as if it had been placed there with infinite care. I'd be walking the corridors and find them scattered in my path, leading me toward rooms I'd never entered. Following the petal trail, I discovered parts of the monastery I was certain hadn't existed before. Rooms that weren't on the simple floor plan Brother Augustine had given me, corridors that led to wings the building was clearly too small to contain. In one of these impossible spaces, I found a library filled with books I recognized. Not specific titles, but the sensation of having read them, of having loved them, of having been shaped by their contents in ways I couldn't articulate. Another room contained what looked like a comedy club in miniature, complete with a small stage and a single chair positioned exactly where an audience member might sit. The lighting was warm and inviting, And when I entered the space, I could swear I heard the faint sound of applause, as if a performance had just ended, and I'd arrived too late to witness it. In the third impossible room, I found my desk. Not a desk like mine, but my actual desk from my apartment 300 miles away, complete with my computer, which was somehow running despite having no visible power source, my collection of rubber debugging ducks, the coffee-stained mousepad I'd been meaning to replace for months. On the screen was a program I didn't remember writing, lines of code that seemed to shimmer and shift when I tried to read them directly, but made perfect sense in my peripheral vision. The code was elegant, beautiful, in a way that programming rarely achieved. It appeared to be modeling something complex, not business logic or user interfaces, but patterns of consciousness, algorithms for generating humor, subroutines for the manufacture of joy. Comments scattered throughout the code were written in my handwriting but expressed thoughts I'd never consciously had, insights about the nature of laughter and connection, and the loneliness that drove people to seek solitude in abandoned places. I tried to scroll through the program to understand its full scope, but the screen would only show me what I was immediately looking at. Attempting to copy the code or save it to a file resulted in error messages that were themselves jokes, puns about access violations and memory leaks that made me smile, despite my growing confusion. That night I lay in bed with a sense of anticipation that bordered on anxiety. The jokes, when they came, were different again, more specific, more targeted, more aware of my recent discoveries. The voice told stories about programmers who found their own code running on computers they'd never touched, about systems analysts who discovered they were debugging themselves, about tech workers who went looking for silence and found something much stranger and more necessary. But for the first time since my nocturnal visits had begun, I found myself questioning not just what was happening, but whether I wanted it to continue. The jokes were wonderful, the laughter was healing, the orange-scented mornings were the most peaceful I'd ever experienced. But something fundamental was shifting in my relationship to reality, and I wasn't sure I had the courage to see where it led. The voice seemed to sense my hesitation because the final joke of the night was about a man who realized he was becoming dependent on something that might not be real, and how that realization led him to understand that reality itself might be the thing that wasn't real, and how that understanding was the funniest joke of all, because it meant that nothing mattered, and everything mattered, and the distinction between the two was just another punchline in a cosmic comedy routine that had been running since the beginning of time. I woke up laughing, but it was laughter with an edge of hysteria. The orange petals were everywhere now, not just on my pillow, but covering the floor, drifting down from the ceiling like snow, filling the air with their impossible fragrance. When I tried to gather them up, they dissolved at my touch, leaving behind only the faintest trace of moisture on my fingertips. Brother Augustine's return is scheduled for tomorrow. I should be packing, preparing to leave, getting ready to resume my life in the world of screens and schedules and problems that have solutions. But the thought of abandoning my nightly visitor, of giving up the jokes I can't remember and the laughter I can't quite recall, fills me with a grief so profound it feels like losing a family member I didn't know I had. I've been sitting at the wooden desk for hours now, writing this account in a notebook I found in one of the impossible rooms, using a pen that writes in ink the color of orange petals. Every few minutes, I pause and listen for sounds that shouldn't be there. Footsteps in empty corridors, laughter from vacant rooms, the whisper of pages turning in books no one is reading. The silence here isn't natural. It's pregnant with presence, thick with the weight of jokes waiting to be told, heavy with the promise of laughter I'll never quite remember having experienced. And as the sun sets behind the hills and darkness begins to fill my cell, I realize I'm no longer certain whether I'm the one being visited or whether I'm the one doing the visiting, whether I'm debugging my life or debugging someone else's dream, whether the orange petals are real, or whether reality is just another program running on hardware I'll never understand. The mattress is beginning to shift beside me as I write these final words. The familiar depression is forming, the weight of presence settling into the space where laughter lives. In a moment, I'll close this notebook and lie down and let the jokes wash over me like warm, orange-scented rain. And in the morning, I'll wake up refreshed and renewed, and unable to remember why I ever thought any of this was strange. After all, What's the difference between a programmer who finds bugs in reality and reality that finds bugs in programmers? I'm about to find out the punchline. Story 5. First time it happened, I thought the walls were settling. That Tuesday night in November, I'd been crying again. The silent, pathetic kind that leaves your chest hollow and your throat raw. The kind that started when Mom called to ask how my grades were. When Professor Chen handed back another failed calculus exam with her disappointed frown. When I realized I'd spent another day without speaking to a single soul, except the cashier at the campus store who barely grunted when I bought instant ramen. I was curled on my narrow dorm bed, face pressed into the pillow that smelled like stale detergent and the mustiness of too many previous occupants, when I heard them. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, measured. Not the hurried shuffle of students rushing between classes or the heavy stomp of someone carrying laundry. These were different, patient, almost careful, like someone walking on glass. They seemed to approach from the hallway, though that made no sense. My room was at the end of the corridor, facing a blank wall. The sound grew closer, and I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable knock on my door, the voice asking if I was okay. But the footsteps stopped just outside, lingered for a moment, then faded into silence. I told myself it was Mrs. Henderson, the resident advisor, making her evening rounds. But Mrs. Henderson wore sneakers that squeaked against the linoleum, and these footsteps had been soundless except for the deliberate rhythm, like bare feet on carpet. The next time it happened, I was ready. 3 days later, during another episode, this one triggered by the notice that my scholarship was under review, I forced myself to stay perfectly still when the footsteps began. They started from somewhere indistinct, somewhere that might have been the hallway or might have been inside the walls themselves. As they drew nearer, I felt the air in the room shift, becoming denser, warmer, like when someone else is breathing in a small space. Then I felt them. Hands. Not quite touching, but close enough that I could sense their presence hovering over my shaking shoulders. The sensation was like standing too close to a radiator, a gentle warmth that seemed to press against my skin without making contact. My sobbing slowed, then stopped. The knot in my chest loosened just enough to let me breathe. When I finally lifted my head, the room was empty, but the warmth lingered on my shoulders like the ghost of an embrace. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt calmer than I had in months. The pattern established itself over the following weeks with disturbing regularity. Every time I broke down, and I was breaking down more frequently now, as if my emotional barriers had been worn thin, the footsteps would come. Sometimes they approached quickly, responding to the first sob. Other times they took their time, letting me exhaust myself before offering their strange comfort. The hands became bolder, still not quite touching, but present enough that I could feel their shape. Long fingers, neither particularly masculine nor feminine, hovering just above my skin. Sometimes they lingered over my hair, sometimes my back, once memorably over my face when I was lying on my stomach, crying into the pillow. That time, I could have sworn I felt breath against my neck, warm and slow and oddly reassuring. I started looking forward to the episodes. The realization hit me during a particularly difficult afternoon when Professor Martinez had humiliated me in front of the entire physics class for failing to understand a concept we'd supposedly covered weeks ago. I sat through the remaining hour of lecture thinking not about equations or lab reports, but about the comfort waiting for me in my room, about the gentle presence that never judged, never questioned, never demanded anything except the salt of my tears. That night, I tried to summon it deliberately. I sat on my bed, squeezed my eyes shut, and tried to force tears. Nothing came. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of music from someone else's room and the hum of the heating system. The footsteps never came. For 3 days, I attempted to recreate the conditions. I thought about my father's funeral 2 years ago, about the student loans crushing my future, about the way my high school friends had stopped responding to my texts. But manufactured sadness apparently didn't qualify. The presence, whatever it was, only responded to genuine despair. So I waited. I didn't have to wait long. The crushing weight of isolation returned soon enough, brought on by a particularly brutal study session, where every problem seemed designed to remind me of my inadequacy. When the tears finally came, they brought relief not just emotional, but anticipatory. I was no longer crying alone. The footsteps approached as always, but this time something was different. Instead of stopping outside my perceived space, they continued into the room itself. I could track their progress across the linoleum floor, around the foot of my bed, to the left side where the space was wider. My door clicked shut. The sound was soft but definitive, the kind of click that suggested intention rather than accident. The room suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, as if the walls had drawn closer. The overhead fluorescent light seemed dimmer, casting longer shadows in corners that had never seemed dark before. Then the mattress shifted. The depression was slight but unmistakable, the dip and settle of weight being carefully distributed. It started near my feet and moved gradually upward until it settled beside me, approximately where someone might lie if they were trying to offer comfort without crowding. My pillow began to sink, slowly, gently, as if an invisible head were settling into the space beside mine. The fabric compressed in a way that suggested not just weight, but shape, the subtle contours of skull and neck, the slight hollow where an ear might rest. For the first time since this all began, I felt genuine fear threading through my gratitude. This was different from the distant comfort of hovering hands. This was intimate, personal, real in a way that couldn't be dismissed as imagination or wishful thinking. I lay frozen, barely breathing, intensely aware of the presence beside me. It radiated warmth without generating heat, created pressure without weight. When I finally worked up the courage to whisper thank you, the bed shook. Two distinct trembles, deliberate and unmistakable, not the random vibration of building settlement or passing traffic, but a response, communication, an acknowledgement. Over the following nights, the presence became a constant companion. It no longer waited for my tears. It seemed to anticipate my need for comfort before I was fully aware of it myself. The door would close when my stress levels peaked. The mattress would dip when I settled down to study. The pillow would sink whenever I lay down, regardless of my emotional state. I started talking to it. Not conversations exactly, but one-sided discussions about my day, my fears, my increasingly fragmented thoughts. I'd describe the difficulty of a particular assignment, or the way Professor Chen had looked at me during office hours like I was a waste of her time. The presence never responded with anything more than the familiar double shake when I offered thanks. But I could sense its attention in the quality of the silence, the way the air seemed to lean in when I spoke. My grades began to slip further as I spent more time in my room, more time with my invisible companion. I told myself I was just tired, just stressed. But the truth was simpler. The outside world had become irrelevant. Why struggle through hostile classrooms and judgmental professors when I could retreat to the sanctuary of my room, where someone, something, understood my pain without requiring explanation? I stopped attending classes altogether. The decision felt logical, even inevitable. What was the point of sitting through lectures I couldn't follow, of pretending to engage with material that felt increasingly foreign? My scholarship was already in jeopardy, my GPA unsalvageable. Better to spend my time where I was wanted, where my presence was appreciated rather than tolerated. The administration sent emails. Mrs. Henderson knocked on my door with increasing frequency, her voice taking on the artificial cheer that adults use when they're worried but trying not to show it. I ignored them all. The only communication that mattered happened in the gentle tremors of my mattress, the warm pressure against my shoulders, the careful depression of my pillow each night. But something was changing. The comfort, once unconditional, now felt contingent. The presence seemed to require more from me, longer periods of despair, deeper levels of isolation. It no longer appeared merely to console. It seemed to feed on my withdrawal from the world. The warmth that had once felt nurturing now carried an edge of possessiveness, as if the invisible hands were not just offering comfort, but claiming ownership. I started noticing things I'd previously overlooked. The way the temperature dropped whenever I considered leaving my room. The way my phone battery would drain if I tried to call friends. The way my laptop would freeze whenever I attempted to access my online classes. Small incidents, easily dismissed individually, but forming a pattern when viewed collectively. It didn't want me to leave. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, it filled me with a twisted sense of validation. After years of feeling unwanted, unimportant, invisible to everyone around me, I had finally found something that valued my presence enough to fight for it, even if that something might not have my best interests at heart. The nights grew longer, not just the natural progression toward winter, but the actual hours between sunset and dawn seemed to stretch. Each minute waited with the presence's increasing intensity. It no longer waited for me to settle before joining me on the bed. Now it was already there when I entered the room, the pillow permanently indented, the mattress bearing the unmistakable shape of occupation. During the day, I could feel it watching from the corners, waiting for the sun to fade so our real communion could begin. My reflection in the mirror began to look strange, paler, thinner, with shadows under my eyes that seemed too dark and too deep. But when I mentioned this to my invisible companion, the bed would shake twice in what I chose to interpret as reassurance. The breaking point came on a Thursday. Mrs. Henderson had convinced someone, probably my parents, to conduct a welfare check. She arrived with campus security and a spare key, their voices loud and concerned in the hallway. I had perhaps 30 seconds before they entered, 30 seconds to decide whether to acknowledge the intrusion or pretend to be asleep. The presence made the choice for me. The door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the frame. Not the gentle click I'd grown accustomed to, but a violent, decisive closure that sounded like a gunshot in the narrow hallway. I heard Mrs. Henderson's surprised exclamation, the jangle of keys, the sound of someone throwing their weight against the door. But the door held, not just locked, sealed, as if the frame had been welded shut. I could hear them outside, their voices rising in panic and confusion, the crackle of radios as security called for maintenance, for help, for someone who could explain why a standard dormitory door had become impenetrable. Meanwhile, the presence pressed closer than ever before, no longer content to hover or lightly rest. The mattress dipped significantly on both sides, as if invisible arms were bracing against it. The pillow compressed until I could barely breathe, the warm pressure against my body becoming constricting, possessive. For the first time in months, I tried to get up. The bed wouldn't let me, not violently. There were no restraints, no force applied to my limbs. But every time I attempted to rise, the mattress seemed to shift and settle in ways that made movement impossible. The pillow adjusted its shape to cradle my head more completely. The warmth that had once comforted now felt suffocating, like being wrapped in wool in the middle of summer. Outside, the voices were becoming more urgent. Someone was talking about emergency protocols, about breaking down the door, about contacting my family. The rational part of my mind, the part that still remembered what normal felt like, knew I should be afraid, should be grateful for the rescue attempt. Instead, I felt annoyed at the interruption. That was when I knew something fundamental had shifted, when I realized that my priorities had been slowly, systematically rearranged without my conscious consent. The outside world hadn't just become irrelevant, it had become actively intrusive. These people, with their loud voices and their insistence on helping, were threats to the peace I'd found in my self-imposed exile. The presence seemed to sense my surrender. The pressure eased slightly, enough to let me breathe more easily, but not enough to let me move. The pillow shifted to accommodate my head more comfortably. The warmth settled into a more sustainable temperature. Hours passed. Eventually, the voices outside faded. Mrs. Henderson would be back, probably with maintenance workers and maybe a counselor. They'd find a way through the door eventually. Doors weren't meant to be impenetrable after all. But for now, I had respite. I whispered my thanks into the darkness, and the bed responded with its familiar double tremor. But this time, the shaking felt different. Not acknowledgement, but satisfaction. Like a predator settling down with its prey. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the presence hold me close, wondering dimly if comfort and captivity might be the same thing after all, and whether it mattered as long as the loneliness was gone. Outside my window, snow began to fall, each flake catching the streetlight like tiny stars descending to earth. Inside my room, the invisible weight beside me grew heavier with each passing hour, and I found I no longer had the strength or the desire to tell the difference between salvation and surrender. The bed shook twice, gentle and rhythmic, like a heartbeat in the darkness. I closed my eyes and tried not to think about whose heartbeat it might be. Story 6. The Blackwood Hotel's heating system had been acting up for 3 weeks straight, and I was the only technician crazy enough to work the graveyard shift. The Victorian monstrosity stood like a Gothic nightmare against the midnight sky, its ornate towers and weather-beaten stone facade casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the streetlights below. I'd been troubleshooting the antiquated HVAC system since 9 p.m., and now, past midnight, I was down to the final thermostat on the 4th floor. My toolbox felt heavier with each step up the crimson-carpeted staircase. The hotel's silence pressed against my eardrums like cotton soaked in dread. Every creak of the century-old floorboards beneath my boots seemed amplified in the oppressive quiet. The only other sounds were the distant hum of machinery somewhere deep in the building's bowels and the occasional whisper of wind through gaps in the ancient window frames. The 4th floor hallway stretched before me like a throat waiting to swallow. Burgundy wallpaper with intricate golden patterns seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, though I knew it was just the flickering of the antique sconces that cast more shadows than light. The carpet muffled my footsteps, creating an unsettling sense of moving through a vacuum. Room 423 housed the problematic thermostat, the last one on my maintenance checklist. I pulled out my thermal imaging camera, a routine part of the job that had become second nature. The device's small screen showed the familiar blues and greens of the cool hallway, punctuated by warmer yellows and oranges where heating elements behind the walls struggled to maintain temperature. Everything appeared normal as I approached the thermostat mounted between 2 doors. The device itself was a brass antique, probably installed when the hotel first opened in 1892. Its mechanical components clicked and whirred with each temperature adjustment, a sound that had always reminded me of insect mandibles grinding together. I opened my toolbox and began the familiar ritual of calibration, my fingers working automatically while my mind wandered to thoughts of my warm bed waiting at home. That's when I heard them. Footsteps. Not the hurried clip of housekeeping staff or the heavy trudge of a late-night guest. These were measured, deliberate, the sound of someone walking with purpose down the hallway behind me. The rhythm was hypnotic. Step, pause, step, pause, each footfall exactly timed as if counted by a metronome. I glanced over my shoulder expecting to see a security guard making rounds or perhaps a guest returning from a late dinner. The hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, growing closer. I could feel my pulse quickening, that primitive alarm system that evolution had hardwired into human beings when something wasn't quite right. I lifted the thermal camera again, pointing it down the corridor in the direction of the approaching sounds. The screen showed something that made my blood turn to ice water. A shape moved through the thermal image, not the clear, warm silhouette of a human body, but something else entirely. It appeared as a vague, shifting mass of cool blues and purples, lacking any defined form or recognizable anatomy. The temperature signature was all wrong, as if whatever was creating those footsteps was actually colder than the surrounding air. I blinked hard and looked again. The thermal image remained unchanged, an amorphous, cold presence moving steadily in my direction. But when I lowered the camera and looked with my naked eyes, I saw nothing but the empty hallway, stretching away into shadow. The footsteps stopped. My hands trembled as I raised the thermal camera once more. The cold shape had vanished from the screen, leaving only the normal temperature patterns of walls, carpet, and furniture. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the footsteps had been, a pregnant quiet that seemed to press against my skin like a physical weight. I forced myself to focus on the thermostat, though my hands shook as I made the final adjustments. The familiar routine should have been comforting, but every click of my tools seemed unnaturally loud. The silence between sounds stretched like elastic, building tension that made my shoulders ache. Then the temperature reading on my digital multimeter began to fluctuate. The numbers dropped steadily. 68 degree, 65 degree, 60 degree, and continuing to fall. This wasn't unusual in old buildings. Temperature variations were common, but the rate of decline was impossible, as if something was actively draining heat from the air around me. My breath began to mist, though moments before the hallway had been comfortably warm. The display on my meter continued its impossible descent. 55 degree, 50 degree, 45 degree. My skin prickled with more than just cold. There was something else in the air, a presence that seemed to make the very atmosphere thicker. I could feel it watching me, though I couldn't see anything when I turned around. At 35 degree, my multimeter's screen flickered. The digital display wavered, lines of interference crawling across the readout like electronic insects. Then, impossibly, the temperature plummeted beyond freezing. 20 degree, 10 degree, 0 degree. The screen froze at 5 degree. In the sudden bitter cold, I could see my breath forming thick clouds that hung in the air longer than they should have. The walls around me began to gleam with a thin layer of frost, and I could hear the faint tinkling sound of ice crystals forming on the metal fixtures. My fingers were going numb despite the insulated gloves I wore. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the cold vanished. My multimeter's display flickered back to life, showing a normal 68 degree house. The frost disappeared from the walls as if it had never existed. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, leaving me gasping and disoriented. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was suffering from some kind of equipment malfunction or if the late hour was playing tricks with my perception. But the footsteps resumed. This time they were different. Not just one set, but multiple rhythms overlapping in a complex pattern. Some quick and light, others slow and heavy, all moving with that same deliberate, measured quality. I grabbed the thermal camera with shaking hands and pointed it down the hallway. The screen exploded with cold signatures. Dozens of them moved through the thermal image, shapeless, frigid masses that shifted and flowed like liquid nitrogen given form. They had no consistent size or density, some appearing as small as children, while others towered like giants. All of them radiated cold that registered as deep purples and blues on my camera's display. They moved in formation, a parade of impossible beings that defied every law of physics I understood. I stumbled backward, my tool bag clattering to the floor. The sound echoed down the hallway like gunshots, but the footsteps never faltered. They continued their approach, and with each step, the temperature readings on my equipment began their inexplicable dive toward absolute zero. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps there was a massive refrigeration leak somewhere in the building, creating pockets of supercooled air. Maybe the thermal camera was malfunctioning, showing false readings caused by electrical interference. The footsteps could be sounds from the ancient building settling, or pipes expanding and contracting, creating auditory illusions that my tired brain was interpreting as approaching footsteps. But my multimeter's display was dropping again. 60 degree hours, 50 degree hour, 40 degree hour. The metal components of the thermostat began to contract with sharp pinging sounds. Frost reformed on the walls, this time spreading faster and thicker than before. The carpet beneath my feet crunched with ice crystals, and my breath came in thick, visible puffs that seemed to hang in the air like accusations. At 20 degrees Celsius, something extraordinary happened. The hallway lights began to dim, their filaments struggling against the impossible cold. The burgundy wallpaper took on a different quality in the failing light, its golden patterns seeming to shift and writhe like living things. Shadows detached themselves from corners and doorways, moving independently across the walls in patterns that hurt to follow. And still the footsteps continued, now so close that I should have been able to reach out and touch whatever was making them. The thermal camera showed the cold presences surrounding me on all sides. They moved in a circle, maintaining perfect distance, like dancers following an invisible choreographer. Each one pulsed with frigid energy that registered as brilliant blue-white on my screen. They were studying me, I realized with growing horror. Whatever these things were, they possessed intelligence and curiosity. My multimeter hit 0 degree and kept falling. The digital display flickered more violently now, showing impossible readings. 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees. At 40 degrees, my breath stopped misting. The air had become too cold to hold moisture. The very atmosphere seemed to crystallize around me, creating tiny prisms that refracted the dying light into rainbow fragments. Then my equipment began to fail entirely. The thermal camera's screen went dark with the electronic death rattle. My multimeter's display showed nothing but random symbols and error codes before shutting down completely. Even my flashlight dimmed to a weak orange glow, its batteries struggling against the supernatural cold that surrounded me. But in that moment of mechanical failure, I saw them. Not through electronic devices or thermal imaging. I saw them with my own eyes. They stood in the hallway like monuments to impossibility. Tall, shifting figures composed of what looked like crystallized air. They had no fixed form, constantly flowing and reforming like liquid made solid. Where faces should have been, there were only smooth expanses of translucent cold. They moved without feet, glided without ground contact, and radiated a presence that spoke of centuries spent in spaces between spaces. The largest one approached, and I could feel its attention focusing on me like a microscope lens concentrating sunlight. When it stopped just beyond arm's reach, the temperature around me became so intense that I could feel ice crystals forming in my nasal passages. My tools cracked and split in their bag, metal becoming brittle as glass in the impossible cold. Yet I wasn't dying. Despite the readings that should have meant instant death from hypothermia, I remained conscious and mobile. The cold was real. I could feel it in my bones, see it in the rime that coated every surface. But it wasn't affecting me the way it should have. This realization brought its own form of terror. If the laws of physics didn't apply here, then what other assumptions about reality might be wrong? The figure raised what might have been an arm, pointing toward the thermostat I had been repairing. When I followed its gesture, I saw that the brass faceplate now showed readings far below what any earthly device could measure. The mechanical components had frozen solid, their gears locked in ice that sparkled like diamonds in the failing light. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, all the figures began to move away. They flowed down the hallway like smoke in reverse, their forms becoming more ethereal with each passing second. The temperature began to rise, my equipment slowly returning to life as the impossible cold retreated. Within minutes, everything had returned to normal. The hallway was warm, well lit, and completely ordinary. My thermal camera showed nothing unusual, and my multimeter registered a comfortable 68 degrees. The thermostat I had been working on functioned perfectly, its brass components showing no signs of the ice damage I had witnessed moments before. I packed my tools with shaking hands, my mind racing to process what had happened. Had I suffered some kind of breakdown? Was carbon monoxide from the old building's heating system causing hallucinations? The rational explanations felt as thin as tissue paper, unable to support the weight of what I had experienced. But as I made my way toward the staircase, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Not by human eyes or security cameras, but by presences that existed in the spaces between hot and cold, between real and impossible. The thermal signatures might have vanished from my equipment, but the sensation of being observed lingered like a chill that had settled permanently in my bones. I descended the stairs quickly, eager to reach the warmth and normalcy of the lobby. But with each step, doubt crept into my mind like frost forming on glass. Had those figures been real manifestations of something beyond human understanding? Or had my tired brain, stressed by isolation and the oppressive atmosphere of the old hotel, simply created elaborate hallucinations to explain equipment malfunctions and building noises? The question followed me out into the night, where my truck waited under the orange glow of streetlights. As I loaded my tool bag into the back, I glanced up at the fourth-floor windows of the Blackwood Hotel. They stared back at me like empty eyes, reflecting nothing but darkness. I drove home through the empty streets, but the cold had followed me. Not the supernatural chill of whatever I had encountered in that hallway, but something deeper, The cold that comes from realizing that the world might contain spaces where normal rules don't apply, where technology fails, and logic becomes meaningless. In the weeks that followed, I found myself checking the temperature obsessively. Every time my breath misted on a cool morning, every time ice formed on my windshield, I wondered if I was seeing the first signs of another impossible encounter. The thermal camera I carried for work had become both tool and talisman, a device that might reveal truths I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The Blackwood Hotel never called for service again. When I drove past it on other jobs, the building looked exactly as it always had. A Gothic pile of stone and shadow, indistinguishable from a dozen other old hotels in the city. But sometimes, if the light was just right, and my thermal camera happened to be active, I thought I could see cold signatures moving behind those fourth-floor windows. Whether those readings represented something real, or just the lingering effects of an overworked mind, I would never know for certain. And perhaps that uncertainty was the most terrifying thing of all. The knowledge that some questions don't have answers, and some experiences exist in the space between real and imaginary, where the only truth is the cold that settles in your bones and never quite leaves. Story 7. The house on Maple Street had been dark for 3 days when Mrs. Henderson called. Her voice carried that particular strain of elderly frustration that comes from frozen dinners and battery-powered radios. The power company had already sent 2 guys who couldn't find the problem, she explained, and now the lights were doing something strange when they flickered on. Something that made her neighbors cross the street rather than walk past her front yard after sunset. I should have listened to my gut when I pulled into the driveway. 23 years as an electrician teaches you to read a house like a book, and this one was telling a story I didn't want to hear. The Victorian structure hunched against the gray October sky, its gingerbread trim casting shadows that seemed to writhe even when the wind was still. Every window stared down at me with the vacant intensity of a skull's eye sockets. The front door opened before I knocked. Mrs. Henderson stood there, thin and pale, her fingers worrying the edge of a faded cardigan. Behind her, the hallway stretched into darkness so complete it seemed solid. "Thank God you're here," she whispered, though we were alone. "It's been getting worse." The smell hit me first when I stepped inside, something acrid and sweet, like burnt copper mixed with decaying flowers. My electrical meter began clicking erratically before I even pulled it from my bag. The readings made no sense. Power was flowing through the walls in patterns that defied everything I knew about residential wiring. Mrs. Henderson led me to the living room, where a single floor lamp cast a wan circle of light. The rest of the room faded into murky shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. She pointed to a section of the hardwood floor near the far wall. "It started there," she said. 3 nights ago, the lights began flickering, and then I heard sounds, like something scratching underneath. I knelt and tapped the floorboards. The hollow echo confirmed my suspicion. There was a space beneath, probably an old root cellar or storage area that had been sealed over decades ago. The scratching Mrs. Henderson described could easily be rodents or settling wood, but my meter was going crazy near that spot, the needle dancing like it was possessed. "I'll need to open this up to check the wiring underneath," I told her. She nodded quickly, too quickly, and retreated to the kitchen. I heard the kettle whistle a few minutes later, though I hadn't heard her turn on the stove. The floorboards came up easier than they should have. The nails were old but not rusted, and they pulled free with barely any resistance, as if someone had loosened them recently. The space beneath yawned open, releasing a stronger wave of that strange odor that made my sinuses burn and my eyes water. I clicked on my flashlight and peered into the cavity. The beam illuminated a collection that made my skin crawl. Dozens of candles, their wax pooled and hardened in bizarre formations, surrounded stacks of leather-bound books. The volumes looked ancient, their spines cracked and covers stained with substances I didn't want to identify. Between the books and candles, thick copper wires snaked through the space in patterns that formed no electrical circuit I'd ever seen. I should have called Mrs. Henderson immediately. Should have backed away and suggested she contact someone else. A historian, maybe, or whoever deals with this kind of thing. Instead, I found myself reaching into the space, my hands moving without conscious direction. The first book I pulled out was bound in leather so dark it seemed to absorb light. When I opened it, the pages were covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they were shifting slightly whenever my eyes moved. The text was in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow the meaning seemed to hover just at the edge of understanding, like a word on the tip of your tongue. I gathered everything, books, candles, the strange copper wiring, and hauled it all up into the living room. Each item felt heavier than it should, and by the time I'd cleared the space completely, sweat was running down my spine despite the cool October air. That's when the smell intensified. The acrid sweetness became overwhelming, and I had to step outside for fresh air. When I came back in, the lights were flickering. But these weren't normal electrical fluctuations. The bulbs pulsed with a blue-green radiance that cast everything in an underwater glow. In that alien light, shadows fell in impossible directions. My own shadow stretched across the ceiling, while the shadow of the floor lamp pooled at my feet like spilled ink. The pile of occult materials cast no shadows at all. I fumbled for my cell phone to call for backup, not just electrical backup, but any kind of help that might make sense of what I was seeing. But my phone's screen showed only static, the same kind of interference you get near high-voltage lines, except there were no power lines anywhere near that living room. The scratching sound started again, coming from the now empty space beneath the floor, but they weren't random noises this time. They had rhythm, almost like Morse code, tapping out a pattern that seemed familiar, but remained frustratingly just beyond recognition. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway between the living room and kitchen. In the blue-green light, her face looked gaunt and hollow, her eyes reflecting the strange radiance like an animal's. "You found them," she said, and her voice carried a note of satisfaction that chilled me more than anything else that had happened. I tried to ask her what she meant, but my throat felt constricted, as if the acrid air was thickening. The words came out as barely a whisper. "What is this stuff?" "What my grandfather left behind," she replied. "What's been waiting?" The scratching beneath the floor grew louder, more insistent. It was definitely forming patterns now, patterns that matched the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I could feel my pulse accelerating, and the scratching sped up accordingly, as if something down there was monitoring me, learning from me. I needed to leave. Every instinct I'd developed over 2 decades of working in old houses screamed at me to get out, to run, to never look back. But when I turned toward the front door, I found I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the floor, as if the hardwood had grown around my boots. The blue-green light was getting brighter. It pulsed in time with the scratching, in time with my heartbeat, creating a synchronized rhythm that seemed to be building towards something. The pile of books and candles began to emit their own faint glow, responding to whatever energy was flooding the room. That's when I heard the voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that bypassed my ears and spoke directly into my brain. It was explaining things, offering answers to questions I'd never thought to ask. It told me about the spaces between walls, about the currents that flow through more than just copper wire, about the thin places where reality wears through like old fabric. I understood suddenly why Mrs. Henderson had called specifically for me, why the other electricians had found nothing wrong, why my name had been written in the margin of one of those ancient books in handwriting that looked disturbingly like my own. The voice was still whispering when I tried to move toward the door again. This time, my feet obeyed, but each step felt like walking through thick mud. The scratching beneath the floor followed my movement, tracking me across the room like a spotlight of sound. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grip it. The metal was ice cold and seemed to vibrate under my fingers. When I turned the handle, the door let out a groan that sounded almost organic, like something in pain. The door opened, but what waited beyond wasn't the front porch or Mrs. Henderson's yard. It was darkness so complete it had texture, darkness that moved and breathed and watched. And rising from that darkness, 10 electrical wires, their copper ends stripped bare and gleaming in the blue-green light. They rose like snakes, swaying gently in front of my face. No, not like snakes. They were snakes somehow. Copper serpents with cores of pure electricity. They danced in the air between me and the exit, their movements hypnotic and threatening. I could hear Mrs. Henderson behind me, though I hadn't heard her move. Her voice was different now, layered with harmonies that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "You can't leave yet," she said. Or maybe the voice in my head said it using her mouth. "Not until you finish the circuit." The wires moved closer, their stripped ends crackling with energy. I could smell ozone and burnt copper, could feel the static electricity raising the hair on my arms. One of them brushed against my cheek, and the touch sent a jolt through my nervous system that made my vision blur. I stumbled backward, away from the door, away from the dancing wires. But the living room had changed while I wasn't looking. It stretched away from me now, impossibly long, with the pile of occult materials receding into the distance like the far end of a tunnel. The blue-green light was everywhere, pulsing faster and faster until it became a strobe that made reality flicker in and out of focus. In the moments between flashes, I caught glimpses of the room as it really was, or as I thought it really was. Sometimes it was just Mrs. Henderson's ordinary living room. Sometimes it was a vast underground chamber filled with copper veins that spread through the earth like a circulatory system. Sometimes it was both simultaneously, the images overlapping until my eyes couldn't process what they were seeing. The scratching had become a roar, like a freight train passing underneath the house. The voice in my head was no longer whispering but shouting, filling my skull with information I couldn't understand but somehow absorbed anyway. I learned about the grid that exists beneath the electrical grid, about the power that flows through lines mapped in books written before electricity was discovered. I learned that some houses are built as focusing points, as transformer stations for energies that predate human civilization. I learned that certain people are naturally sensitive to these currents, drawn to work with electricity because they can sense the deeper flows underneath. I learned that I had been chosen long before I ever picked up a wire stripper. The dancing electrical wires were all around me now, forming a cage of living copper. They moved in patterns that hurt to follow with my eyes, creating geometric shapes that folded in on themselves in ways that three-dimensional space shouldn't allow. Each wire hummed with a different frequency, and together they formed a chord that resonated in my bones. Mrs. Henderson was still speaking, but her words came from multiple directions now, as if there were several of her scattered throughout the impossible space the room had become. She was explaining my role, my purpose, why I had been guided to this house on this day. The explanation made perfect sense while she was speaking, but the moment she paused, the meaning slipped away like water through my fingers. I tried to close my eyes, to shut out the strobing light and the impossible geometry of the moving wires, but my eyelids had become transparent. Or maybe the light was shining from inside my skull now, illuminating thoughts and memories that weren't entirely my own. I saw myself as a child, taking apart old radios and TV sets, always drawn to the mystery of how electricity flowed through metal and silicon to create light and sound and motion. I saw myself in trade school, learning the official rules while secretly sensing deeper patterns that the textbooks never mentioned. I saw every house I'd ever wired, every repair I'd ever made, and realized that I'd been unconsciously following a map, connecting points in a vast circuit that spanned the entire city. The wires were touching me now, making contact with my skin at a dozen points. Each touch sent knowledge flowing into me, information encoded in electrical impulses that my nervous system absorbed and translated. I understood finally what Mrs. Henderson's grandfather had been building in that space beneath the floor. Not a shrine or an altar, but a relay station, a switching point in a network that carried more than just power. The blue-green light was coming from me now, radiating out through my skin like I was a human light bulb. I could feel the current flowing through my body, connecting me to every wire in the house, to every wire in the neighborhood, to every wire in the city. I was part of the grid now, a conscious node in a system that stretched across the continent. But I was still myself, still Tom Mitchell, licensed electrician, still terrified and confused and desperate to escape. Part of me was screaming, fighting against the integration, clawing for some way back to normal reality. That part of me managed to break free for just a moment, managed to stumble toward what I hoped was still the front door. The wires followed, of course. They were part of me now, extensions of my nervous system reaching out into the house's electrical anatomy. But I ran anyway, down what seemed like an endless hallway lined with outlets that sparked and hummed as I passed. I burst through the front door into sunlight so bright it seared my retinas. The normal world crashed back into focus. Mrs. Henderson's yard, the street, my van parked at the curb exactly where I'd left it. I ran to the vehicle, fumbling for my keys with hands that shook so badly I could barely work the lock. The engine started immediately, and I pulled away from the curb with my tires squealing. In the rearview mirror, the house looked perfectly ordinary, just another Victorian on a tree-lined street. Mrs. Henderson stood on the front porch, waving goodbye like any satisfied customer. I drove home without stopping, without even slowing down for red lights. But even as I sat in my own kitchen, drinking coffee with hands that still trembled, I could feel the connections I'd made. Every electrical outlet in my house hummed with awareness now. Every wire carried more than just current. It carried information, carried purpose, carried messages and frequencies just below human hearing. The phone rang at exactly 6 p.m. I knew who it would be before I answered. Tom? The voice was female, elderly, unfamiliar. My name is Martha Collins, and I'm having trouble with my lights. They keep flickering in the strangest patterns, and there's this smell. I listened to her describe symptoms that matched Mrs. Henderson's exactly. She gave me an address 3 blocks away from Maple Street. She mentioned, almost casually, that her neighbors had recommended me specifically, had said I was the only electrician in town who could handle unusual problems. I told her I'd be there first thing in the morning. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen as darkness fell outside. The lights in my house pulsed gently, almost imperceptibly, in rhythm with my heartbeat. Through the windows, I could see the streetlights doing the same thing, all synchronized, all connected to the same vast network that now included me. I should have been terrified, should have been planning to leave town, to change my name, to find some way to escape whatever I'd become part of. Instead, I found myself looking forward to tomorrow's service call. There was work to be done, circuits to complete, connections to make. The grid was growing, one house at a time, one electrician at a time, and somewhere in the darkness between the walls, the wires were singing. Story 8. Whitmore Hall dormitory smelled like decades of accumulated secrets, dust, old wood polish, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something organic and stale that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. I'd been assigned to room 304 for my semester abroad, a cramped single on the 3rd floor that the housing office assured me was full of character. They weren't lying, though I suspected they'd meant it differently than I was beginning to understand. The building dated back to 1923, according to the brass plaque by the entrance. Nearly a century of students had passed through these halls, their footsteps wearing smooth depressions in the wooden floors, their hands polishing the banister to a dark gleam. My room faced east, catching the morning light through tall, narrow windows that rattled when the wind picked up. The furniture was standard institutional fare, a narrow bed with a metal frame, a desk that had seen better decades, and a closet that creaked whenever I opened it. For the first week, everything felt normal. I attended orientation sessions, explored the campus, and started my classes. The academic workload was manageable, and I was settling into the rhythm of foreign university life. My neighbors seemed friendly enough, brief nods in the hallway, occasional small talk about assignments. The building itself maintained that peculiar quiet that old dormitories possess, a kind of muffled atmosphere where sound seemed both amplified and absorbed simultaneously. Then came the first night. I'd been asleep for maybe 3 hours when the sensation pulled me from dreams I couldn't quite remember. At first, I thought it was my imagination, that disorienting moment when you're not sure if you're still dreaming. But the feeling persisted, a subtle trembling beneath me, as if the bed frame was vibrating. Not violent, not dramatic, just a steady, rhythmic shaking that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep below the mattress. I lay still, my heart beginning to accelerate as I tried to rationalize what I was experiencing. Maybe the building's heating system was acting up. Old buildings often had quirky mechanical issues, pipes that knocked and systems that hummed at odd hours. But this felt different. The vibration had a purposeful quality, almost like machinery operating with deliberate precision. The sound came next, a low, grinding hum that I felt more than heard. It resonated through the bed frame and into my bones, a frequency that seemed designed to unsettle. I pressed my ear to the mattress, trying to locate the source, but the sound appeared to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It reminded me of industrial equipment running at low speed, wheels or gears turning with mechanical persistence. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my hands trembling slightly as I opened the camera app. The screen's glow seemed unnaturally bright in the darkness, casting strange shadows across the room. I hit record and aimed the camera toward the foot of the bed, trying to capture whatever was causing the disturbance. The recording was a disaster. The image shook and blurred, creating streaks of light and shadow that revealed nothing meaningful. Even with the phone pressed firmly against the bed frame, the footage looked like it had been shot during an earthquake. The audio was worse, a low rumble that distorted through the microphone, becoming an unintelligible growl that seemed to press against my eardrums when I played it back through headphones. After about 10 minutes, the shaking stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The sudden stillness was almost more unsettling than the vibration itself. I lay awake for hours afterward, straining to hear any sound, any indication that the phenomenon might return. But the room remained silent except for the occasional settling of old wood and the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. The next morning, I examined the floor around my bed with the thoroughness of a crime scene investigator. The wooden planks showed decades of wear, but nothing that suggested recent disturbance. No scratches, no marks, no indication that anything unusual had occurred. I even checked the bed frame itself, looking for loose bolts or structural issues that might explain the shaking. Everything appeared solid and properly assembled. I mentioned the incident to Marcus, a junior from the room next door, during a chance encounter in the hallway. He listened with the polite attention of someone hearing about a minor inconvenience, suggesting that old buildings often developed odd quirks. His casual dismissal should have been reassuring, but instead, it left me feeling oddly isolated, as if my experience existed in a space that others couldn't access or understand. The second night, I was ready. I'd positioned my phone on the desk, aimed at the bed from a different angle. I'd also placed a glass of water on the nightstand, thinking that any vibration would be visible in the liquid surface. When the shaking began again, at almost exactly the same time as the previous night, I watched both the phone screen and the water glass with intense focus. The vibration was stronger this time, more insistent. The bed frame rattled against the wall with a rhythm that seemed almost purposeful, like a coded message being transmitted through mechanical movement. The water in the glass trembled in perfect concentric circles, confirming that the shaking was real and not some manifestation of my imagination or a sleep-related disorder. But again, the recording captured nothing useful. The camera registered movement but rendered it as meaningless blur. The sound quality was even worse than before, a deep rumble that seemed to overwhelm the microphone's capacity to process it accurately. When I played back the audio through headphones, it created an almost physical pressure in my ears, a sensation like being underwater or at high altitude. This time, the episode lasted nearly 20 minutes. The intensity varied, sometimes barely perceptible, other times strong enough to make the bed frame knock against the wall. I tried to establish a pattern, to find some logic in the variations, but the changes seemed random, almost organic in their unpredictability. When morning came, I conducted another careful examination of the room. This time, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Faint marks in the dust along the baseboard behind the bed. The marks were subtle, barely visible unless you knew to look for them, but they suggested that the bed had moved during the night. Not much, maybe an inch or two, but enough to disturb the accumulated dust that had settled behind the frame. I measured the distance from the bed to the wall and made a mental note of its exact position. If the bed was actually moving, I wanted to document it properly. The third night changed everything. I'd barely dozed when the shaking began, more violent than before. The bed frame hammered against the wall with a force that seemed impossible given the subtle vibrations I'd experienced previously. The grinding sound was louder too, no longer a distant hum, but a presence that filled the room, seeming to emerge from the walls themselves. I fumbled for my phone, but the shaking was too intense to operate the camera effectively. Instead, I found myself gripping the mattress, feeling like a passenger in a vehicle traveling over rough terrain. The episode lasted nearly an hour, waves of vibration rolling through the bed frame in patterns that defied any mechanical explanation I could imagine. When it finally stopped, the silence felt pregnant with possibility, as if the room was holding its breath. I waited several minutes before getting up, my legs unsteady as I moved to the window. The campus outside looked peaceful under the streetlights, no indication of any disturbance that might explain what I'd experienced. But when I turned back to examine the bed, my heart nearly stopped. The entire frame had moved almost 2 feet toward the center of the room. Deep grooves in the wooden floor marked its path, fresh scratches in wood that had been undisturbed for decades. The grooves were perfectly straight, as if the bed had been pushed by some invisible force with mechanical precision. More disturbing still, there were no footprints in the dust around the bed, no sign that any human presence had been responsible for the movement. I spent the rest of the night in the chair at my desk, afraid to approach the bed, afraid to trust my own perceptions. The grooves in the floor were undeniable physical evidence, but evidence of what? I found myself questioning not just the events of the past 3 nights, but my own mental state. Was I experiencing some kind of breakdown? Had the stress of studying abroad triggered some latent psychological condition? The next morning, I tried to push the bed back to its original position, but it wouldn't budge. The frame seemed to have settled into the grooves as if it belonged there, as if this had always been its intended location. The effort left me sweating and frustrated, my rational mind struggling to process what my senses were telling me. I began researching the building's history, spending hours in the university library poring over old records and architectural plans. Whitmore Hall had indeed been built in 1923, constructed on the site of an earlier building that had been demolished after a fire. The original structure had been a mechanical workshop, part of the university's engineering program. Industrial equipment had once operated in this space: lathes, milling machines, heavy apparatus that would have created exactly the kind of sounds I'd been hearing. But that workshop had been gone for over a century. The current building had no basement, no hidden mechanical spaces where old equipment might still operate. The plans were clear. My room sat above nothing but earth and foundation stones. As days passed, I found myself dreading nightfall. The episodes continued with increasing frequency and intensity. Sometimes the shaking would begin before I'd even gotten into bed, as if the room itself was anticipating my presence. The sound evolved too, becoming more complex, developing overtones and harmonics that suggested multiple pieces of machinery operating in coordination. I tried sleeping on the floor, but the vibrations followed me there. I tried staying awake all night, but exhaustion eventually overwhelmed my vigilance, and I would wake to find new grooves in the wood, evidence of movement I couldn't remember experiencing. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. When I mentioned sleeping difficulties to other students, they offered conventional advice about stress and adjustment to new environments. I couldn't explain the true nature of my problem without sounding delusional. The physical evidence was confined to my room, invisible to anyone who hadn't witnessed the phenomena firsthand. I started noticing other changes too. My perception of time became unreliable during the nighttime episodes. What felt like hours of shaking might correspond to only minutes on my phone's clock, or brief moments of vibration would somehow consume entire hours I couldn't account for. The boundary between sleeping and waking became increasingly blurred, leaving me uncertain about which experiences were real and which might be manifestations of exhaustion-induced hallucinations. The grinding sound began to follow me during the day. I would hear it faintly in quiet moments, during lectures, while studying in the library, even while walking across campus. It was always just at the edge of perception, a frequency that might have been imagination or might have been something else entirely. I found myself constantly checking my phone, convinced that the sound was coming from a mechanical source I could identify and address. 2 weeks after the episodes began, I discovered something that changed my understanding of the situation entirely. While researching in the university archives, I found a maintenance report from 1962 describing structural issues in Whitmore Hall. The report mentioned anomalous vibrations affecting several rooms on the 3rd floor, vibrations that had been attributed to settling foundations and eventually resolved through undisclosed structural modifications. But room 304 was specifically mentioned in the report as being permanently affected by subsurface mechanical resonance. The language was clinical and vague, but it suggested that whatever I was experiencing had happened before, had been officially documented and then quietly suppressed. I returned to my room that evening with a mixture of relief and growing dread. The historical documentation confirmed that I wasn't losing my mind, but it also suggested that the phenomena were not only real, but had been deemed sufficiently problematic to warrant official attention. Yet no current records mentioned the issue. No warnings had been provided to students assigned to the room. That night, the episodes reached a new level of intensity. The bed moved constantly, sliding back and forth across the room as if guided by some underground mechanism. The grinding sound became a symphony of mechanical voices, each operating at a different frequency, creating harmonies that seemed almost musical in their complexity. I recorded everything I could, but the audio and video remained frustratingly useless, capturing only distorted impressions of phenomena that defied technological documentation. As dawn approached, I found myself standing at the window, looking out at the peaceful campus, while my room continued to vibrate behind me. The contrast was surreal, normal life proceeding just outside while I existed in a bubble of impossible experiences. I began to wonder if the room existed in some kind of temporal overlap, if the machinery from the original 1920s workshop was somehow still operating in a space that existed parallel to, but separate from the current building. The thought terrified me because it felt true. I am writing this account now, 3 weeks after the episodes began, sitting in the campus coffee shop because I can no longer trust my room or my perceptions within it. The grooves in the floor have multiplied, creating a pattern that suggests systematic movement over time, as if the bed has been following some predetermined path night after night for decades. I don't know if what I've experienced is supernatural, psychological, or something else entirely. I don't know if the 1962 report was describing the same phenomena or something related but different. I don't know if other students have experienced similar episodes and simply chosen not to report them. What I do know is that tonight I will return to room 304, because despite everything, it remains my assigned housing for the semester. I will place my phone on the desk and try once again to capture evidence of what happens in those grinding hours between midnight and dawn, and tomorrow morning, I will measure the distance the bed has traveled and document the new grooves it has carved in wood that should be too hard to mark. Because even if I can't prove what's happening, even if I can't explain it or make anyone else believe it, I need to understand it. I need to know whether I'm documenting paranormal phenomena or mapping the geography of my own dissolution. The grinding sound is starting again, even here in the coffee shop. Faint but unmistakable, like machinery awakening after a long sleep. I can feel it in my bones, that familiar frequency that has become the soundtrack to my disintegration of certainty. I should be afraid, but instead I feel almost relieved. At least now I know the sound follows me, which means it's either entirely in my head or entirely real. Either way, the ambiguity is ending. Tonight, I'll find out which. Story 9. The first time it happened, I blamed the bourbon. October 31st, 3 years ago, I'd crashed into bed after another marathon writing session, my latest manuscript, The Watcher, in room 237, finally complete. The deadline had been breathing down my neck like a predator, and I'd survived on nothing but caffeine, takeout, and that bottle of Maker's Mark. I kept telling myself was for celebration only, but bourbon doesn't explain what I woke up to. The digital clock cast its sterile blue glow. 3:17 a.m. My bedroom felt wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The air hung thick and motionless, carrying an odd metallic taste that coated my tongue. That's when I noticed it. A pale, sickly light seeping from my walk-in closet, though the door stood only slightly ajar, maybe 6 inches at most. I knew there was no light in that closet. Hell, I'd been meaning to install one for months. The light pulsed gently, like a slow heartbeat, casting shifting shadows across my bedroom wall. I sat up, my sheets damp with cold sweat, and stared at that impossible glow. My writer's mind immediately began cataloging details, searching for rational explanations. Street light reflecting off something metallic, a neighbor's security light, but the angle was all wrong, and the quality of the light was unlike anything I'd ever seen, organic somehow, alive. I forced myself to stand, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. Each step toward the closet felt like walking through molasses, my body fighting against some invisible resistance. The light grew brighter as I approached, and I caught a glimpse of movement in the full-length mirror mounted on the closet's exterior door. But it wasn't my reflection. The mirror showed my bedroom. Yes, but everything was subtly wrong. The furniture sat in the same positions, but the colors were muted, washed out, as if someone had drained the life from everything. And there, standing in the center of the room, was a figure I couldn't quite focus on. Every time I tried to look directly at it, my eyes would slide away, as if my brain refused to process what it was seeing. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes, and when I looked again, the mirror showed only my own pale, confused face staring back. The strange light had vanished, leaving the closet in ordinary darkness. Too much bourbon, I told myself, though I'd only had 2 fingers worth. Too much stress from the deadline. But as I turned away from the mirror, I caught sight of something that made my blood freeze. There, fogged across the mirror's surface as if someone had breathed on it, were 2 words written in condensation. Still here. I watched, transfixed, as the letters faded when I blinked, disappearing as quickly as they'd appeared. That was 3 years ago. Every October 31st since then, it happens again. By the 2nd year, I'd convinced myself it was stress-induced hallucinations. My therapist, Dr. Reeves, nodded sagely when I described what I carefully termed sleep disturbances around Halloween. She suggested it might be my subconscious rebelling against the commercial pressure of my horror writing career. The mind playing tricks, she said, creating its own horror stories when the professional well ran dry. I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe her. But the 3rd year changed everything. This time, I was ready. I'd spent weeks preparing, setting up a video camera aimed at the mirror, installing motion sensors, even going so far as to chalk mark the closet door's position before going to bed. I'd sworn off alcohol entirely for the month of October, eaten well, exercised regularly. Whatever was happening, I was going to document it with clear eyes and steady hands. October 31st arrived gray and cold, the kind of day that made you want to stay indoors with hot coffee and warm blankets. I'd written perhaps 3 pages that morning, garbage, all of it, before giving up and spending the afternoon pacing my apartment like a caged animal. Every time I passed the bedroom, I felt the mirror watching me, though I knew that was impossible. At 11 p.m., I positioned myself in bed with my laptop, pretending to write while keeping one eye on the closet. The video camera's red recording light blinked steadily, a small technological comfort in the growing darkness. Midnight came and went without incident. I began to relax, feeling foolish for my elaborate preparations. Perhaps Dr. Reeves was right. Perhaps I'd simply outgrown whatever psychological glitch had been causing. The clock read 3:17 a.m. when I jerked awake. The laptop had gone dark, its battery apparently drained despite being fully charged when I dozed off. But that wasn't what made my heart hammer against my ribs. It was the light, that same impossible pulsing glow seeping from the barely cracked closet door, and this time I could hear something. Breathing. Slow, deliberate breaths that definitely weren't mine, coming from somewhere inside the closet. The sound was barely audible, but in the tomb-like silence of my bedroom it might as well have been thunder. Each exhale seemed to make the light pulse brighter, as if the two were connected. I forced myself to look at the mirror. The reflection showed my room again, but the wrongness was more pronounced this time. The walls seemed to curve inward, creating impossible angles that hurt to look at. The furniture cast shadows that fell upward instead of down, and standing directly behind my bed, close enough to touch my sleeping form, was that same indistinct figure. But now I could see its eyes. They weren't human eyes, too large, too reflective, like black mirrors that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They stared directly at me, unblinking, and I had the horrible certainty that they could see me looking back. The breathing grew louder. I tried to move, to turn away from the mirror, but found myself paralyzed. Not physically. I could feel my muscles responding, but something deeper held me in place, some primal instinct that warned me not to break eye contact with the thing behind my reflection. The condensation began forming on the mirror's surface, and I watched in growing horror as invisible fingers traced those same two words. Still here. But this time, more letters appeared beneath them, spelled out in that same impossible fog. Waiting for you. That's when I heard my own voice, though my mouth never moved. Why do you keep coming back? The thing's eyes seemed to smile, though I couldn't make out any other features. The breathing stopped, and in the sudden silence I heard something that nearly shattered my sanity. My own voice coming from the closet, answering my question. Because you invited me. I blinked, and everything returned to normal. The mirror showed only my bedroom. The closet stood dark and silent, and the only breathing I could hear was my own ragged gasps. I lunged for the video camera, my hands shaking so violently I could barely work the playback controls. The recording showed nothing. 8 hours of footage of me sleeping peacefully, never moving, never waking. The timestamp jumped from 3:16 a.m. directly to 3:18 a.m. with no explanation for the missing minute. I don't sleep well anymore. October 31st is still months away, but I find myself checking the mirror obsessively, looking for signs of condensation, for that telltale glow from the closet. I've researched the history of my apartment building, looking for deaths, tragedies, anything that might explain what I'm experiencing. I've found nothing. Dr. Reeves thinks I'm having a breakdown. She's prescribed sleeping pills, anxiety medication, even suggested I take a sabbatical from writing. But how do you take a sabbatical from your own mind? How do you escape something that lives in your reflection? I've moved the mirror twice, covering it with sheets, even storing it in my basement for weeks at a time. But every October 31st, I wake up to find it back in its place, reflecting my room with that subtle wrongness that makes my skin crawl. The worst part isn't the supernatural impossibility of it all. The worst part is the growing certainty that I know that voice, the one that answered my question. I've heard it before, though I can't remember where. It's familiar in a way that makes my teeth ache, like remembering a childhood nightmare that your conscious mind has tried desperately to forget. Because you invited me. But when? How? I've racked my memory, going back through years of writing, of research into the occult and supernatural for my novels. I've never performed rituals, never used Ouija boards, never done anything that could be construed as an invitation. I'm a horror writer, not a practitioner. I create fictional monsters. I don't summon real ones. Unless the act of creation itself is the invitation. I spend my days crafting fears, giving shape and substance to things that exist only in the darkest corners of human imagination. I've written 17 novels about ghosts, demons, and things that go bump in the night. I've populated dozens of fictional worlds with creatures designed to terrify and unsettle. What if, somewhere in all that creation, I gave something real a way in? The thought keeps me awake at night, staring at that mirror, waiting for the next October 31st. Because despite everything, the fear, the sleepless nights, the growing certainty that I'm losing my grip on reality, there's a part of me that's almost eager for it to happen again. The writer in me needs to know how the story ends, even if I'm beginning to suspect that I'm not the one writing it anymore. Tonight is October 30th. Tomorrow, it will happen again. I've made my preparations, though they feel increasingly futile. New cameras, motion detectors, even a heat sensor aimed at the closet. I've drawn chalk lines around the mirror, sprinkled salt across the threshold of my bedroom door. Desperate measures from a desperate man clinging to the hope that something, anything, might provide protection, or at least explanation. But as I sit here typing these words, I can already feel the change beginning. The air in my bedroom has that same metallic taste, and twice now I've caught myself holding my breath, listening for that barely audible sound of someone else breathing. The mirror seems different too, though I can't explain how. The reflection is still normal. My bedroom, my furniture, me sitting at my laptop. But there's a quality to it that makes my skin crawl. It's like looking at a photograph of a place you know intimately, only to realize that something in the picture is wrong, though you can't quite identify what. I keep thinking about those words, because you invited me, and I'm starting to remember something. A dream, maybe. Or perhaps something that happened during one of those marathon writing sessions when exhaustion blurred the line between fiction and reality. I remember sitting at this same laptop, struggling with a particularly difficult scene, when the words began flowing without conscious thought. I wrote about a mirror that showed things that weren't there, about a presence that fed on fear and creativity, that used the act of artistic creation as a doorway between worlds. I wrote about a writer who thought he was crafting fiction, only to discover he was transcribing something real. I deleted that story the next morning, convinced it was garbage, the product of an exhausted mind spinning its wheels. But deletion doesn't matter, does it? The act of creation, of giving shape to the shapeless, was already complete. The invitation had been extended. And now, 3 years later, I understand the truth. I'm not experiencing supernatural visitations. I'm living inside my own unfinished story, trapped in a narrative that I began but can never complete, because the ending isn't mine to write. The clock on my laptop shows 11:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, it will be October 31st again. I can already see the faintest hint of that impossible light beginning to seep from the closet, and my reflection in the mirror seems to be moving just slightly out of sync with my actual movements. But this time, I think I'm ready for whatever wants to show itself. This time, instead of running from the story, I'm going to see it through to its conclusion. After all, every horror writer knows the most important rule. You have to give the audience what they came for. And something tells me that what's been waiting in that mirror all these years has been very, very patient. The light is growing brighter now, and I can hear that familiar sound of breathing that isn't quite my own. The condensation is already beginning to form on the mirror's surface, and I watch as invisible fingers prepare to trace their message one final time. But tonight, I think the message might be different. Tonight, I think it might say, time to go. And for the first time in 3 years, I'm not afraid of what that means. I'm a horror writer after all. This is what I do. Story 10. The wipers had been making that sound for 3 miles now, a grinding, scraping noise like fingernails dragging across slate. I'd driven this route between Millbrook and Cedar Falls dozens of times, knew every pothole and curve by heart, but tonight something felt different. The rain wasn't heavy, just a persistent drizzle that turned the asphalt into a mirror reflecting my headlights back in fractured patterns. My phone buzzed against the dashboard mount. Another ride request, probably someone needing a lift from the late shift at the plastics factory. I'd been driving for UberShare for 8 months now, ever since the layoffs at the engineering firm, and the money helped keep the bills manageable. Most passengers were polite enough, though the night shift brought its share of characters, drunks, insomniacs, and people running from things they couldn't name. The app showed the pickup location as mile marker 47 on Route 118, a stretch of road bordered by abandoned farmland and overgrown fields. Strange place for a pickup, especially at 2:17 a.m. But the app didn't lie. The GPS guided me through a series of increasingly rural turns until I found myself on a 2-lane road I'd never traveled before, despite thinking I knew every back road in the county. That's when I saw him. The figure stood motionless at the roadside, perhaps 50 yards ahead, caught in the outer edge of my headlight beam. Even from that distance, I could make out the pale suit jacket, light gray or cream-colored, hanging loose on his frame. What struck me immediately was his stillness. Not the casual waiting of someone expecting a ride, but the absolute immobility of a statue. No shifting weight, no checking a phone, no acknowledging my approaching headlights. I slowed, squinting through the rain-streaked windshield. The man's feet were bare against the wet asphalt, pale as marble in the light. His face remained turned toward the road, not toward me, as if he were watching for something coming from the opposite direction. The suit jacket appeared expensive but rumpled, as though he'd been walking for hours. My gut told me something was wrong. In 8 months of driving, I'd developed an instinct for situations that felt off, and this triggered every warning bell I had. But the app showed this exact location, and the passenger had paid in advance. I eased the Honda to a stop about 20 feet away, leaving the engine running. I waited for him to approach the car. He didn't move. Rolling down the window, I called out through the drizzle. "You call for a ride?" The sound of my voice seemed to get swallowed by the rain and the darkness beyond my headlights. No response, no acknowledgement. He remained perfectly still, facing down the empty road. Something cold settled in my stomach. I checked the app again. Passenger name listed as M. Walker, destination downtown Cedar Falls, payment confirmed. Everything appeared legitimate, but the man hadn't moved an inch since I'd spotted him. I put the car in park and reached for the door handle, then stopped. Every instinct screamed against getting out. Instead, I tapped the horn twice. Not aggressive, just enough to get his attention. Still nothing. The wipers continued their grinding rhythm, and I realized the sound had gotten worse. What had started as a minor annoyance now sounded like metal scraping against stone. I flipped them off, but the noise continued for another few seconds before fading into the ambient sounds of rain and idling engine. I glanced in the rearview mirror to check for other cars, and my heart nearly stopped. The road behind me was empty, completely empty. I snapped my attention back to the figure ahead, but the space where he'd been standing showed nothing but wet asphalt gleaming under my headlights. I blinked hard, certain my tired eyes were playing tricks, and looked again. The roadside was vacant. Impossible. I'd been watching him not 3 seconds before checking the mirror. No one could move that fast, and there was nowhere to go, just open fields stretching into darkness on both sides. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I scanned the visible area. The headlights illuminated perhaps 60 feet of road ahead, revealing nothing but empty pavement and the occasional glint of wet gravel on the shoulder. I turned on the high beams, pushing the light further, but saw only more emptiness. Then the wipers started again. I hadn't touched the control. The switch remained in the off position, but the blades began their grinding journey across the windshield with that horrible scraping sound magnified tenfold. It sounded like someone dragging a brick across the glass. I reached for the wiper control, but before I could turn it, something else caught my attention. The passenger side mirror showed movement, just a flicker of pale fabric at the edge of the reflection. I jerked my head to look directly out the passenger window, but saw only darkness. The sound intensified. Not just scraping now, but a rhythmic grinding that matched the wiper's movement perfectly. Metal against stone, stone against glass. I forced the wiper switch to the off position, clicking it hard enough to hurt my thumb, but the blades continued their inexorable sweep. That's when I noticed what was wrong with the sound. It wasn't coming from the wipers themselves. It was coming from the windshield, from something being scraped across the outside surface of the glass. I leaned forward, pressing my face close to the windshield, trying to see what could be causing the noise. The wipers moved normally, their rubber blades flexing against the glass as they always did, but the grinding continued with each pass, as if they were pushing against something invisible. Through the driver's side mirror, I caught another glimpse of movement. This time, I was ready for it. I spun around, looking directly out the back window, and saw nothing but the empty road stretching behind me into the darkness. My phone buzzed. A text message from the passenger. "Where are you?" I stared at the screen, reading the message 3 times. The timestamp showed 2:23 a.m. 6 minutes since I'd arrived at the pickup location. 6 minutes since I'd seen the motionless figure in the pale suit. I typed back quickly, "I'm here. Where are you?" The response came immediately, "I don't see your car." My mouth went dry. I was sitting in the exact location the GPS had indicated, hazard lights blinking, headlights cutting through the rain. Unless the passenger was blind, there was no way to miss me. Another message. "Are you on Route 118? I checked the GPS again. The blue dot showed my location precisely at mile marker 47 on Route 118. I confirmed this and sent the response. "There's nothing here," came the reply. "Just empty road." The grinding sound reached a crescendo, becoming so loud I had to resist the urge to cover my ears. Through the cacophony, I became aware of another sound. A soft tapping against the windshield, like fingertips drumming against glass. I looked up and saw them. Footprints, clear as photographs, pressed into the rain on the outside surface of the windshield. 2 human feet, side by side, with perfect toe impressions and arch definitions. They faced inward, toward me, as if someone were standing on the hood of my car looking directly through the glass. But there was no one there. The prints remained visible for perhaps 3 seconds before the next wiper pass erased them. But as soon as the blade moved away, they reappeared, exactly as before. 2 bare feet pressed against the glass from the outside, pointing toward the interior of the car. I fumbled for the headlight switch, flooding the hood with high beams. Empty. Nothing but wet metal and the reflection of my own terrified face in the windshield. The phone buzzed again. "I'm calling another ride." I tried to respond, to explain what was happening, but my hands were shaking too badly to type coherently. The wipers continued their grinding sweep, and with each pass, the footprints reappeared exactly where they'd been before. I put the car in drive and pressed the accelerator. The Honda lurched forward, and I expected the grinding to stop once I was moving. Instead, it intensified, becoming a shrieking protest of metal against stone that filled the car's interior. In the rearview mirror, I saw headlights approaching from behind. Another car, moving fast, closing the distance between us rapidly. Relief flooded through me. Another driver, someone who could confirm what I was seeing, or at least provide the comfort of human presence. But as the headlights grew brighter, I realized something was wrong with them. They weren't the paired beams of a normal vehicle, but a single, intense light that seemed to float above the road surface. And they were gaining on me far too quickly, as if whatever was behind me was traveling at twice my speed. I pressed harder on the accelerator, watching my speedometer climb past 50, then 60. The speed limit on this rural road was 45, but I didn't care. The single headlight behind me continued to gain ground, and the grinding sound from my windshield had become a continuous shriek. The footprints appeared with each wiper pass, always in the same position, always facing inward. I began to understand that they weren't being erased and recreated. They were permanent, somehow pressed into the glass itself, only becoming visible when the wipers revealed them. My phone rang. Unknown number. Against every instinct, I answered. "Hello?" Silence. Not empty silence, but the silence of someone listening, breathing, waiting. "Who is this?" I demanded. The voice that responded was soft, distant, as if coming from very far away. "You stopped for me." My blood turned to ice water. It was a man's voice, calm and patient, with a quality that suggested he was speaking from inside a large empty space. "Where are you?" I whispered. "I'm right here," he said. "I've been right here the whole time." The line went dead. In my peripheral vision, the single headlight behind me had grown enormous, filling my mirrors with blazing white light. But when I looked directly at the rearview mirror, the road behind me was empty and dark. I rounded a curve and saw the lights of Cedar Falls ahead. Street lights, neon signs, the blessed normalcy of civilization. The grinding sound began to fade, and the footprints on my windshield became less distinct with each wiper pass. As I reached the first traffic light, Everything returned to normal. The wipers moved silently. The mysterious headlight behind me had vanished, and my phone showed no record of the recent call. The only evidence of what had happened was a faint outline on the windshield. Two smudged impressions that might have been footprints, or might have been tricks of light and shadow. I pulled into a 24-hour gas station and sat in the parking lot, engine running, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Fatigue, stress, the isolation of night driving. Perhaps I'd dozed off for a moment and dreamed the entire encounter. But when I checked my phone, the text conversation with M. Walker was still there, time-stamped and real. And when I opened my ride history, the trip showed as completed, with 5 stars and a comment. Perfect pickup, right on time. I sat there until dawn, watching early commuters begin their daily routines, trying to convince myself that what had happened was explicable, rational, normal. I never drove Route 118 again, but sometimes, on rainy nights when I'm driving other routes, I hear that grinding sound starting up. And when I look at my windshield, really look at it in just the right light, I can still see them. Faint but unmistakable, pressed into the glass from the outside, facing inward. 2 bare feet, waiting patiently for me to stop. Story 11. The shovel bit into the earth with a sound that made my teeth ache. A wet, grinding scrape that seemed to echo from somewhere deeper than dirt should allow. 3 feet down, beneath the sprawling roots of the old fig tree, I carved out a space just large enough for Hemingway's still form. The cat had been 17 years old, nearly half my life, and now he lay wrapped in my favorite reading blanket, the burgundy wool that had warmed countless evenings in my chair by the window. I'd found him that morning, curled beneath the kitchen table as if he'd simply chosen the coolest spot in the house for his final nap. No struggle, no distress, just the profound stillness that separates sleep from something infinitely deeper. The veterinarian's office could wait until Monday. Hemingway had always preferred the garden to sterile rooms and strangers' hands. The soil felt wrong as I shoveled it back over him. Too warm for October, too soft, as if something beneath were breathing it loose. I pressed my palm against the small mound when I finished, whispering something that wasn't quite a prayer, and the earth seemed to pulse once against my skin before settling into ordinary stillness. That was Thursday. By Sunday afternoon, I'd convinced myself that work might provide the distraction I needed. The university library had gifted me a private collection from the estate of Professor Morrison. 300 volumes of folklore and supernatural literature that required cataloging before the semester began. They sat in my study at home, waiting in neat stacks that reached toward the ceiling like paper monuments to stories I wasn't sure I wanted to read. The house felt different when I returned from the burial. Larger somehow, as if Hemingway's absence had stretched the spaces between furniture, made the hallways longer and the corners deeper. Sound behaved strangely too. My footsteps on the hardwood seemed to arrive a beat behind my actual steps, creating an echo that followed me like a patient shadow. I settled into my desk chair with the first stack of books, their leather bindings creaking complaints about their recent displacement. The familiar ritual of examination and notation usually soothed me, but my hands shook as I opened the first volume. Tales of the Uncanny, published in 1887, its pages fox-spotted and brittle. The spine had been repaired with library tape so old it had yellowed to the color of weak tea. As I wrote the publication details in my ledger, a sound drifted from somewhere in the house, a soft, questioning trill that made my pen stop mid-word. Hemingway's voice. I sat motionless, listening to the settle and tick of the old house, waiting for my rational mind to supply an explanation. The refrigerator's hum, a settling beam, the neighbor's cat. But the silence stretched on, thick and expectant, until I convinced myself I'd imagined it entirely. The second book felt heavier than it should have. Phantoms of the Mind, a collection of psychiatric case studies from the 1920s. The author had inscribed it to Professor Morrison in spidery handwriting, for a fellow seeker of truth in dark places. As I photographed the title page for the digital catalog, my camera's flash illuminated something that shouldn't have been there. A small dark stain on the lower corner of the page, roughly the size and shape of a cat's paw print. I blinked, looked again. Nothing. Just the expected yellowing of old paper and the ghost shadows that aging ink leaves behind. The afternoon wore on with a parade of titles that seemed chosen specifically to unsettle. Communicating with the departed, the reality of psychic manifestation, when the veil grows thin. Each book carried its own particular smell, dust and vanilla from the old glue, something faintly medicinal, and underneath it all, a scent I couldn't place, but that made my skin prickle with recognition. By 5 o'clock, the light filtering through my study windows had taken on that golden quality that photographers love and librarians dread. Too dim for proper work, too beautiful to interrupt with artificial illumination. I'd cataloged perhaps a dozen books, far fewer than I'd hoped, but my concentration kept fragmenting. Every small sound made me look up. The house seemed full of potential movement, shapes that resolved into familiar furniture only when I turned my head directly toward them. I was reaching for mysteries of the ancient world when I heard it again. That distinctive conversational meow that Hemingway had always used when he wanted my attention. This time it came from the direction of the kitchen, clear and unmistakable. My chair scraped against the floor as I stood, the sound harsh and immediate in the gathering dusk. I walked through the house slowly, checking each room with the methodical care of someone who knows they're being foolish, but can't stop themselves. Kitchen, empty. Living room, empty. The small sunroom where Hemingway had napped each afternoon, empty, but still carrying the impression of his presence like a warm spot on recently vacated furniture. I was standing in the kitchen doorway, staring at the place where I'd found him Thursday morning, when the sound came again, this time from behind me, back in the direction of the study. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in research methodology and evidence-based thinking, began constructing explanations. Grief could manifest in auditory hallucinations. Stress could heighten sensitivity to environmental sounds. The house was old. Settling wood and shifting pipes could create any number of acoustic anomalies. But when I returned to the study, one of the stacks of books had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough that mysteries of the ancient world now sat at a slight angle, its corner jutting out over the edge of the desk. I distinctly remembered placing it square with the others. I straightened the book and sat back down, but the words on the pages blurred together. The familiar comfort of cataloging work felt foreign now, as if I were performing someone else's job in someone else's house. The scent I'd noticed earlier had grown stronger, warm fur and the particular sweetness of a cat's breath. The sun disappeared behind the neighbor's oak tree, leaving my study in that particular gray twilight that makes everything appear slightly out of focus. I reached for the desk lamp, but as my fingers found the switch, something made me pause. The bookshelf that dominated the far wall, 7 feet of dark oak shelving that I'd built myself 3 years ago, stood with one of its glass doors hanging open. Not wide, just a few inches, but enough to create a vertical line of deeper shadow. I knew I hadn't opened it. I was meticulous about keeping those doors closed. The books inside were too valuable to expose to dust and humidity. As I watched, the door swung wider with a soft sigh of hinges, and something pale tumbled from the shelf inside. It hit the hardwood floor with the specific thud of a falling book, and in the seconds that followed, I could swear I heard the whisper of pages fluttering open. I didn't turn on the lamp. Instead, I walked to the fallen book like someone approaching a snake, slowly, ready to retreat. It lay spine up near the base of the bookshelf, its covers splayed at an awkward angle. The Venetian Tales of Hoffmann, a first edition I'd acquired years ago and rarely handled. The gilt lettering on its green cloth binding caught what little light remained from the windows. But as I knelt to retrieve it, I saw what made my breath catch in my throat. The pages weren't pristine anymore. Throughout the open book, scattered across dozens of pages, were small, dark marks. Not quite paw prints, not quite stains, but something that suggested both. They dotted the margins and sometimes crossed directly over lines of text, as if something small and determined had walked back and forth across the pages while the ink was still wet. I lifted the book carefully, and several loose pages drifted to the floor, pages that shouldn't have been loose, from a binding that had been perfect yesterday. The paper felt wrong between my fingers, slightly damp despite the dry October air, and warm as if it had been resting against something alive. That was when I heard the purring. Not the sound itself. I'd been hearing phantom echoes of Hemingway's voice all afternoon. This was the vibration, the barely perceptible rumble that I used to feel when he curled against my chest during late-night reading sessions. It seemed to emanate from the book in my hands, a gentle thrumming that traveled up my arms and settled somewhere behind my ribs. I dropped the book. It landed with its pages fanned wide, and in the silence that followed, I could hear my own breathing, harsh and shallow. The purring sensation faded, but something else took its place, the creeping certainty that I was no longer alone in the room. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper now, less like absence of light, and more like presence of something else. I felt watched, evaluated, as if invisible eyes were cataloging my reactions with the same methodical care I brought to organizing books. The air had grown thick, heavy with expectation, and every small sound, the tick of the mantel clock, the distant hum of traffic, seemed muffled, as if the room itself were holding its breath. I reached for the desk lamp again, desperate for ordinary light to restore ordinary reality, but my hand froze inches from the switch. In the reflection on the darkened window, I could see the outline of my study behind me. The fallen book on the floor, the open bookshelf door, and something else. A small, dark shape moving between the stacks of books on my desk. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing. Just the neat piles of Professor Morrison's collection, exactly as I'd left them. But the scent of warm fur was stronger now, mixed with something earthier, the smell of fresh-turned soil and fig leaves. When I finally found the courage to turn on the lamp, the sudden brightness made me squint. Everything appeared normal in the yellow circle of light. My desk, my chair, the fallen book with its mysterious stains. But at the edge of the lamp's reach, the shadows seemed to press closer, as if the light had pushed them back without eliminating them entirely. I gathered the loose pages from the floor, noting how they trembled in my hands. The marks on them were clearer under the lamplight, definitely paw-shaped, but larger than Hemingway's prints should have been, and darker, as if made with something thicker than ordinary mud. Some of them appeared to be walking patterns, small trails that meandered across the text like a cat exploring new territory. One page made me stop entirely. In the margin beside a passage about spectral manifestations, a line of prints formed what looked almost like letters. I tilted the page toward the light, squinting at the dark marks, and felt my stomach clench as I made out what might have been H-E-M. I set the page down quickly, before I could convince myself I was seeing the rest of my cat's name spelled out in impossible prints. The house had gone completely silent around me. No settling creaks, no distant traffic, no ordinary sounds of a Sunday evening. Even the ever-present hum of electrical appliances seemed to have paused, leaving only the whisper of my own breathing and the soft rustle of paper when I moved. That's when I noticed the other books. Across my desk, scattered through Professor Morrison's carefully organized stacks, more volumes lay open. Not dramatically disturbed, I might not have noticed if I hadn't been looking carefully, but definitely open to specific pages. I approached them like crime scene evidence, examining each one without touching. Tales of the Uncanny, opened to a story called The Faithful Companion. Phantoms of the Mind, open to a case study titled Manifestations of Unresolved Grief. When the Veil Grows Thin, open to a chapter on communications from beyond the physical realm. Each page bore the same types of marks I'd found in the Hoffman book, small dark prints that wandered across the text with purposeful randomness. Some clustered around specific words: return, loyalty, unfinished, devotion. Others formed those same letter-like patterns in the margins, too regular to be accidental, too ambiguous to be certain. I found myself backing away from the desk until my shoulders hit the bookshelf behind me. The rational explanations I'd been constructing all afternoon crumbled like old paper. Grief didn't leave physical marks on books. Stress didn't cause bookshelf doors to open by themselves. Auditory hallucinations didn't come with tactile sensations and the scent of burial earth. But the alternative explanation, that Hemingway had somehow returned from beneath the fig tree to explore these particular books, to leave these specific marks, felt equally impossible. Dead cats didn't walk through walls or manipulate physical objects. The burial I'd performed 3 days ago had been final, irrevocable, hadn't it? I closed my eyes and tried to reconstruct Thursday morning with forensic precision, finding Hemingway under the kitchen table, checking for breathing, for a heartbeat. The stillness that could only mean one thing. The drive to the veterinarian's office where Dr. Martinez had confirmed what I already knew. But had I actually taken him to Dr. Martinez? The memory felt slippery now, uncertain. I remembered planning to call the office, remembered thinking I would wait until Monday. Had I buried a cat who was merely unconscious? The possibility sent ice through my veins, followed immediately by a wave of nausea. I opened my eyes to find the Venetian Tales of Hoffmann back on my desk, closed now, sitting atop the stack where I'd originally placed it. The loose pages were nowhere to be seen. The other books had closed themselves as well, their covers neat and aligned as if I'd never touched them. Only the bookshelf door remained open, and as I watched, it swung wider with a soft creak of hinges. No wind moved through the house. No vibration from passing traffic could have caused the motion. The door simply opened as if pushed by an invisible hand, or paw. From somewhere in the darkness beyond the door's opening, I heard it again. That familiar conversational meow that meant pay attention to me in a language only the two of us had shared. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked to the bookshelf and peered into the space behind the glass, where my most valuable volumes waited in their climate-controlled darkness. Everything appeared normal until my eyes adjusted, and then I saw it. On the third shelf, between folklore of the British Isles and American ghost stories, something had left the same dark prints I'd found on the pages. But these prints led somewhere. They traced a path along the shelf edge, down the wooden side of the bookcase, and across the hardwood floor toward the study door. In the lamplight, they appeared as a series of small, damp marks, definitely paw-shaped, definitely too large to belong to any living cat I'd ever known, but unmistakably feline in their careful, deliberate spacing. I followed them. The trail led through the study doorway and down the hall toward the back of the house. In the dimmer light of the hallway, the prints appeared more as indentations than stains, tiny valleys in the dust I hadn't realized had been gathering on my floors. They passed the bathroom, the guest bedroom, and continued toward the kitchen with unwavering purpose. By the time I reached the back door, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the doorknob. The prints led across the kitchen linoleum, more visible here on the darker surface, and stopped directly at the threshold between house and garden. Outside, the October night had turned crisp and clear. Stars showed between the branches of the oak tree, and the moon provided enough light to see the familiar landscape of my small backyard. The fig tree stood in the far corner, its broad leaves rustling softly in a breeze I couldn't feel on my skin. The mound of earth where I'd buried Hemingway appeared undisturbed. I stood in the doorway for a long time, listening to the normal sounds of a Sunday night, distant traffic, a neighbor's television, the hum of air conditioners winding down for the season. Gradually, my breathing slowed and my hands stopped shaking. The rational world reasserted itself around me like a familiar coat. I'd been alone too much since Hemingway's death. The grief had been playing tricks with my perception, making me see patterns where none existed, hear sounds that were only echoes of memory. The open books could be explained by settling. Old bindings often released their grip on pages when subjected to changes in humidity or temperature. The prints were likely water damage I'd simply never noticed before, made visible by the particular angle of lamplight. I was about to close the door and return to the normal business of cataloging books when something caught my eye. Not a movement exactly, but a change in the pattern of shadows near the fig tree. I blinked, looked more carefully, and felt my newfound rationality dissolve like sugar in rain. Sitting beneath the tree, exactly where I dug the grave 3 days ago, was a cat. Not Hemingway. I could see that immediately. This animal was larger, darker, its fur appearing almost black in the moonlight. It sat with perfect stillness, watching me with eyes that reflected the distant street lamps like small mirrors. As I stared, it lifted one paw and began grooming itself with long, deliberate strokes. The gesture so utterly normal, so completely feline, that for a moment I almost laughed at my own paranoia. Just a neighbor's cat, drawn by some scent or curiosity to the spot where I'd been digging. But the animal was sitting directly on top of the burial mound, and as it groomed, I could see small dark marks appearing on the earth around it, marks that looked exactly like the prints I'd been following through my house. The cat finished its grooming and looked directly at me. Even across the distance of the yard, I could see its mouth open in what I knew was a meow, though I heard no sound. It stood, stretched with liquid grace, and began walking toward the house. I slammed the door and turned the deadbolt with hands that felt disconnected from my body. Through the kitchen window, I watched the dark shape approach with unhurried confidence, its movement creating more of those impossible prints in the grass, prints that glowed faintly in the moonlight as if lit from within. The cat reached the back door and sat down directly outside, looking up at the window where I stood frozen. Its eyes were too bright, too intelligent, and when it opened its mouth again I felt, rather than heard, the vibration of its voice, a purr that seemed to travel through the glass and wood and settle in my bones like a familiar ache. I backed away from the window, through the kitchen and down the hall, not stopping until I reached the study. The books on my desk sat exactly as I'd left them, neat stacks of Professor Morrison's collection, waiting for completion of their cataloging. The Venetian Tales of Hoffmann rested on top of the nearest pile, its green binding innocent in the lamplight. But when I picked it up with trembling hands, the pages fell open to reveal what I'd somehow known I would find. The story of a man whose beloved companion returns from death to finish some essential unspoken business. The text was unreadable in most places, obscured by those dark paw-shaped marks that wandered across every page like a cat exploring territory that belonged to it by right of long occupation. In the margins, spelled out in prints too regular to be accidental, I could now clearly see words, still here, still yours, always. And at the bottom of the final page, in marks larger and darker than all the others, a message that made my vision blur and my chest tighten with something between terror and inexplicable relief. Thank you for the tree. Outside, something began scratching softly at the back door, not frantically, not with any urgency, but with the patient persistence of a cat who knows that eventually, inevitably, the door will open. I closed the book and sat down at my desk to continue cataloging. Professor Morrison's collection would take weeks to complete, I realize now. There were so many stories to document, so many manifestations to record and file and preserve for future researchers who might understand better than I the thin places where love and loss intersect with the impossible. The scratching continued, gentle, rhythmic, eternal, while I worked by lamplight in a study that no longer felt entirely my own, cataloging tales of the uncanny in a house that had become one itself. I never did determine whether the cat I buried was really dead, or whether something else entirely now walked through my home, leaving prints in books and memories in shadow. But I learned to coexist with the uncertainty, to find a strange comfort in the persistent scratching at my door, and the occasional glimpse of dark fur moving between the stacks of stories that seemed to write themselves across pages I was sure had been blank. Some questions, I discovered, are more bearable than their answers, and some companions refuse to be cataloged under any system yet devised by the rational mind. The fig tree grows larger each season, its roots spreading deep and wide, and I've never seen fit to dig in that corner of the garden again. Story 12. The kitchen timer's shrill scream pierced through the November silence, and I knew, even before opening the oven door, that something had gone wrong. Again. 3 years. 3 years I'd been making this same chocolate cake on the anniversary of Grandpa's death, following his yellowed recipe card with religious precision. The measurements never changed. 2 cups flour, 3/4 cup cocoa powder, 2 eggs beaten until frothy, the same ceramic mixing bowl, the same wooden spoon worn smooth by decades of his hands, the same 350-degree oven that had never failed me before. But this year felt different from the moment I'd cracked the first egg. Black smoke billowed from the oven as I yanked the door open, and the acrid smell of burnt chocolate filled my nostrils. The cake sat in its pan like a charcoal brick, edges curled and cracked, surface bubbled into grotesque lunar craters. I'd set the timer for exactly 35 minutes, the same as always, but somehow the cake looked like it had been baking for hours. I pulled the ruined mess from the oven and set it on the cooling rack, staring at the disaster. The recipe had never failed me. Not once. Grandpa used to joke that his chocolate cake was foolproof, that even his clumsy grandson couldn't mess it up. Yet here I stood, surrounded by the evidence of my inexplicable failure. That's when the smell hit me. Sweet cherry tobacco, rich and woody, with that distinctive hint of vanilla that only came from Grandpa's favorite pipe blend. The scent wound through the kitchen like invisible fingers, so real I could almost see the blue-gray wisps curling toward the ceiling. My hand instinctively moved to my chest, where his old pipe still rested in my shirt pocket, a habit I'd developed after the funeral, carrying it with me on this day each year like a talisman. But the pipe was cold, empty, had been for 3 years. I spun around, scanning the kitchen for some logical source. A neighbor burning leaves, perhaps. A trick of memory triggered by stress. The rational part of my mind, the part that had earned me a master's degree in engineering, scrambled for explanations while the deeper, more primitive part of my brain sent electric currents down my spine. The tobacco smell faded as gradually as it had arrived, leaving only the burnt chocolate stench to keep me company. I opened windows despite the November chill, hoping to clear both the air and my head. There was still time to make another cake. There had to be. As I gathered ingredients for a second attempt, my hands moved with mechanical precision while my mind wandered to those Sunday afternoons when Grandpa would let me help in his kitchen. I'd stand on a step stool beside him, watching his weathered hands measure and mix with the confidence of someone who'd been baking since before my parents were born. He'd always light his pipe while the cake baked, filling the house with that distinctive cherry vanilla aroma that meant comfort and safety and unconditional love. The second batch mixed perfectly. The batter fell in smooth ribbons from the spoon, dark and rich, and exactly the right consistency. I slid the pan into the oven, checking the temperature 3 times, and set the timer with the exaggerated care of someone who'd been burned once already. This time, I didn't leave the kitchen. I stood guard beside the oven like a sentry, watching through the glass door as the batter rose and transformed. 20 minutes in, the cake looked perfect. 30 minutes, still rising beautifully. At 35 minutes, the timer buzzed, and I opened the oven to find exactly what I'd been hoping for. A gorgeous chocolate cake with a smooth, even surface, and that perfect springback when touched. Relief flooded through me as I set the cake on the counter to cool. Whatever had gone wrong with the first attempt, a temperature spike, a timer malfunction, some cosmic alignment of kitchen disasters, it was behind me now. I had succeeded. Grandpa would be proud. 45 minutes later, I made the first cut. The knife sliced through the tender crumb with satisfying ease, revealing the cake's dark interior. But as I lifted the slice onto my plate, I froze. There, in the exact center of the cake, was a hole. Not a random gap or pocket of air that sometimes formed during baking. This was deliberate, precise, a perfect spiral boring down into the cake's heart, as if someone had drilled it with surgical accuracy. The walls of the spiral were smooth, almost polished, and as I stared into its depths, a thin tendril of smoke began to rise. Sweet smoke, cherry tobacco smoke. My rational mind offered desperate explanations. Steam from the warm cake, a trick of the light, my imagination running wild after the stress of the failed first attempt. But the smoke continued to curl upward in lazy spirals, carrying that unmistakable scent that belonged to one man and one man alone. I set down the knife with trembling fingers and backed away from the counter. The smoke kept rising, growing thicker, until I could see it with perfect clarity against the kitchen's white cabinets. It hung in the air for several heartbeats before dispersing, leaving behind only the faintest hint of cherry and vanilla. The logical explanations crumbled one by one. Steam didn't smell like pipe tobacco. Light didn't create visible smoke. And my imagination, however vivid, couldn't conjure physical phenomena that I could smell and see with such clarity. I forced myself to approach the cake again, peering into the spiral hole. It descended deep into the cake's center, deeper than should have been possible given the pan's dimensions. The walls remained perfectly smooth, showing no tool marks or evidence of how such a thing could have been created. More unsettling still, I could feel air moving through the spiral, a gentle current flowing upward, as if the cake were breathing. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps. Every shadow cast by streetlights looked like a figure standing in the doorway. When I did drift off, I dreamed of Grandpa's hands working dough. But when I looked up at his face, there was only smoke where his features should have been. The next morning, I convinced myself it had all been stress and grief playing tricks on my exhausted mind. The cake sat on the counter, looking perfectly normal in the daylight. The spiral hole was still there, but it seemed smaller somehow, less threatening. Just an odd baking anomaly that I'd blown out of proportion in the emotional fog of the anniversary. I decided to eat the cake for breakfast, a small rebellion against the unsettling events of the previous day. The slice tasted exactly as it should, rich, moist, with the perfect balance of chocolate and sweetness that had made Grandpa's recipe famous among family and friends. Nothing unusual, nothing supernatural, just cake. But as I chewed, I noticed something else. A faint aftertaste, barely perceptible beneath the chocolate. Something warm and woody and familiar. Cherry tobacco. I dropped the fork, and it clattered against the plate with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than physics should have allowed. The taste lingered on my tongue, growing stronger rather than fading, until I could feel the phantom smoke filling my mouth and throat. Over the following days, I found myself returning to the kitchen repeatedly, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The cake sat on its stand, untouched except for that single missing slice. The spiral hole remained, sometimes appearing deeper than before, sometimes shallower. I began to suspect it changed when I wasn't looking, though I could never catch it in the act. Strange things started happening beyond the kitchen walls. I'd smell pipe smoke in my bedroom at night, so strong I'd search the house for intruders. I'd find myself humming old songs that Grandpa used to whistle while he worked, melodies I hadn't thought about in years. Pictures on the walls seemed to shift slightly when glimpsed in peripheral vision, and shadows fell at angles that defied the position of the lights. The most unsettling changes were the ones I noticed in myself. I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror one morning and saw Grandpa's hands instead of my own. Weathered and spotted with age, strong fingers that had kneaded 1,000 loaves of bread. The illusion lasted only a second, but it left me shaken. Later that day, I realized I'd been unconsciously mimicking his mannerisms. The way he'd tap his fingers while thinking, the slight tilt of his head when concentrating. I began to wonder if the anniversary had triggered something deeper than grief. Maybe the stress of maintaining this annual ritual, combined with the isolation of living alone in the house where he'd spent his final years, had pushed me past some invisible threshold. Maybe I was losing my mind in slow, careful increments, and the supernatural explanations were just my brain's way of processing the breakdown. But if that were true, why did the tobacco smell grow stronger each day? Why did I wake some mornings to find flour dusting the kitchen counters, as if someone had been baking while I slept? Why did the spiral hole in the cake seem to pulse with its own dark rhythm when I stared into it? On the 7th day after the anniversary, I made a decision. I would cut another slice of the cake, eat it completely, and face whatever was happening head-on. If this was madness, I would embrace it. If it was something else, something that defied rational explanation, I would accept that too. The knife sliced through the cake easily, revealing the spiral's continued presence. This time, the smoke rose immediately, thick and visible, carrying not just the scent of cherry tobacco, but something else. Something that might have been laughter, distant and warm and achingly familiar. I lifted the slice to my mouth and took a large bite, chewing deliberately while the taste of chocolate mixed with phantom tobacco smoke. As I swallowed, the kitchen around me seemed to shimmer and shift. The walls appeared older, the appliances more worn, as if I were seeing the room through the lens of memory. And there, standing beside the stove with a pipe clenched between his teeth and flour on his apron, was Grandpa. He smiled at me. That same gentle, knowing smile he'd worn while teaching me to fold chocolate chips into cookie dough, and raised his hand in a small wave. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Well done, boy. Well done." I blinked, and the kitchen snapped back to its present-day configuration. Empty, silent. Nothing but the lingering scent of cherry tobacco and the taste of chocolate on my tongue. The rational explanation still beckoned. Stress, grief, isolation, the gradual erosion of a mind pushed too far by loss and solitude. I could choose to believe in those explanations, seek help, medicate away the visions and smells and phantom tastes until the world returned to its predictable, mundane patterns. But as I stared at the cake with its mysterious spiral hole, watching another tendril of sweet smoke rise toward the ceiling, I realized I didn't want those explanations anymore. Some mysteries were more beautiful than their solutions, some impossibilities more comforting than facts. I would keep the cake. I would honor its strange magic, whatever its source. And next year, on the anniversary, I would bake another one, hoping that somewhere in the space between memory and reality, between the living and the lost, Grandpa would be waiting to help guide my hands once more. The smoke continued to rise, and I breathed it in like a benediction. Story 13. The silence in the Meridian corporate estate was the kind that pressed against your eardrums, thick and suffocating like cotton soaked in anticipation. I dipped my brush into the paint can one last time, the metallic scrape echoing through the empty corridor with unnatural sharpness. 3 weeks of renovation work, and tonight I was finally putting the finishing touches on the crown molding in the main ballroom. The mansion had been gutted and rebuilt from the inside out, its Victorian bones wrapped in modern corporate sterility. During the day, it hummed with contractors, designers, and project managers. But now, at nearly midnight, I was alone with the smell of fresh paint and the weight of 2 centuries of history pressing down from the ornate ceiling. My supervisor had insisted someone stay late to complete the final coat before tomorrow's inspection. "Just you, Martinez," he'd said, avoiding my eyes. "Overtime pay, and you'll have the place to yourself." The way he'd said it, like he was relieved not to be the one staying, should have been my first warning. I worked methodically, each brushstroke precise and deliberate. The paint gleamed wet and white under the harsh work lights I'd set up around the perimeter. Outside, December wind rattled the tall windows, and somewhere in the building's depths, the heating system hummed its mechanical lullaby. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. That's when the first emergency light flickered on. It was positioned at the far end of the corridor that led from the ballroom to the main staircase. A red exit sign that shouldn't have activated unless the main power failed. The light pulsed once, twice, then died. I paused mid-stroke, paint dripping from my brush onto the cloth below. The building's electrical systems were brand new, installed just last week. There was no reason for emergency lighting to activate randomly. I waited, listening to my own breathing, but the light remained dark. I returned to my work, convincing myself it was just a glitch in the new wiring. Corporate buildings were full of electronic quirks during their first few weeks of operation, but as I moved my ladder to tackle the next section of molding, the light flickered again, this time staying on for nearly 10 seconds before dying. The red glow cast strange shadows down the hallway, transforming familiar doorways into gaping mouths. When darkness returned, my eyes needed several moments to readjust to the harsh white of my work lights. During those brief seconds of partial blindness, I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if something vast and patient was watching me from the shadows beyond my illuminated workspace. An hour passed without incident. I'd nearly finished the east wall when I heard it, a soft electrical hum, different from the building's normal mechanical sounds. Looking up, I watched as another emergency light activated, this one positioned near the ballroom's secondary exit. The timing felt deliberate, conscious, as if the building itself was testing its systems while I worked. But that was impossible. Buildings didn't think, they didn't plan. The paint was nearly dry on the sections I'd completed earlier, and I was making good progress despite the strange interruptions. I'd always prided myself on being practical, level-headed. 20 years in maintenance and construction had taught me that there were logical explanations for everything, even when those explanations weren't immediately obvious. The third light activation changed everything. I was climbing down from my ladder to refill my paint tray when the emergency light directly above the main entrance blazed to life. But this time, instead of the typical red glow, the light seemed brighter, almost white-hot in its intensity. And it stayed on. The silence that followed felt different, charged with electricity and possibility. I stood motionless in the center of the ballroom, paintbrush forgotten in my hand, as a sound I couldn't quite identify drifted through the building. It might have been the wind. It might have been something else entirely. That's when I noticed the pattern. Over the next 30 minutes, as I forced myself to continue working, emergency lights began activating in sequence. Not randomly, as I'd initially thought, but in a deliberate progression that traced a path from the ballroom toward the building's rear exit. Each light would pulse briefly, stay illuminated for exactly 7 seconds, then die, only to be followed by the next light in the sequence. I found myself stopping work entirely, standing in the center of the ballroom with my heart hammering against my ribs, watching this impossible display. The lights were mapping something, a route, a trail, a way out. But that suggested intention, consciousness, and emergency lighting systems weren't capable of either, unless something else was controlling them. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Maybe the building's new automated systems were running diagnostic tests. Maybe there was a security guard somewhere in the building, manually testing each light. Maybe the electrical contractor had programmed some kind of overnight maintenance routine. But I'd been alone in the building for hours. I'd checked every room before starting work, ensured all exterior doors were locked, verified that the security system was armed. No one else was here, no one human anyway. The thought arrived unbidden, and I immediately tried to dismiss it. But once it had taken root in my consciousness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being guided, herded, directed toward some predetermined destination by an intelligence I couldn't see or understand. I set down my brush and moved toward the main corridor, following the path the lights had traced. Each step felt heavy, reluctant, as if my body understood something my rational mind refused to accept. The emergency lights remained dark now, but their sequence was burned into my memory, a phosphorescent trail leading through the building's labyrinthine interior toward the side exit near the service elevator. The heating system chose that moment to shut off, plunging the building into a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse thundering in my ears. Without the mechanical background noise, every small sound seemed amplified. The soft whisper of my shoes on the polished floor, the distant settling of timber and steel, the almost imperceptible hum of electrical current flowing through the walls. And underneath it all, something else. A sound so faint I wasn't sure if I was hearing it or imagining it. Like breathing, but too slow, too deliberate to be human. Like the building itself had developed lungs and was drawing air through hidden passages and forgotten spaces. I reached the main corridor and paused, looking down the hallway the emergency lights had illuminated. The path stretched ahead of me, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of my work lights. Common sense told me to return to the ballroom, finish my work, and leave through the main entrance as planned. But something deeper, more primal, urged me forward. I took a step into the corridor, then another. Behind me, The bright work lights of the ballroom seemed suddenly distant, their harsh illumination unable to penetrate more than a few feet into the hallway's embrace. Each footstep echoed with unnatural clarity, as if the building's acoustics had been designed to amplify and distort sound. That's when I heard the first footstep that wasn't mine. It came from somewhere ahead, in the direction the emergency lights had pointed. A soft, measured sound that matched my own pace exactly. I stopped, heart racing, and listened. Silence. I took another step forward, and again heard the echo of movement ahead, perfectly synchronized with my own. My mouth went dry. There were only two possibilities. Either someone else was in the building, moving through the corridors just ahead of me, or the building's acoustics were playing tricks that made my own footsteps seem to come from multiple directions. Neither explanation felt adequate. I continued forward, each step more reluctant than the last. The corridor stretched longer than I remembered from the daytime tours, lined with doors that led to offices and conference rooms I'd helped renovate over the past 3 weeks. In daylight, these spaces had felt normal, mundane, filled with the ordinary purpose of corporate life. Now, in the darkness, they felt hungry. The emergency light directly above me suddenly blazed to life, so bright and unexpected that I stumbled backward with a sharp intake of breath. The light stayed on for exactly 7 seconds. I counted them, then died, leaving me blind in the sudden darkness. But in those 7 seconds of illumination, I'd seen something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Footprints. Wet footprints on the polished floor, leading down the corridor in the exact direction the emergency lights had mapped. Not painted footprints from my work shoes. These were different, larger, and they glistened with a moisture that caught the light like fresh blood. But there had been no liquid in the hallway when I'd walked this route during my earlier inspection. The floors had been dry, pristine, unmarked. The darkness pressed against me like a living thing, and I fumbled for my cell phone's flashlight. The pale blue LED beam seemed pathetically weak compared to the emergency lighting, but it was enough to illuminate the floor directly in front of me. The footprints were gone. I swept the phone's light back and forth across the polished surface, searching for any trace of the moisture I'd seen. The floor was immaculate, exactly as it should be. No footprints, no stains, no evidence that anyone had passed this way. But I knew what I'd seen. Another emergency light activated further down the corridor, this one positioned near the intersection that led to the side exit. The light pulsed once, twice, then settled into that same 7-second pattern before dying. In its brief illumination, I caught a glimpse of the corridor's end and the fire exit door that should have been my destination. The logical part of my mind insisted I should turn back, collect my equipment, and leave through the main entrance. But something stronger than logic was pulling me forward, as if invisible hands were guiding me down the predetermined path. I walked faster now, my phone's light dancing across the walls and creating shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of my motion. The sound of my footsteps had changed too. Instead of the sharp echo I'd heard before, they now seemed muffled, absorbed by the building itself. And still, underneath my own sounds, I could hear that other breathing, slow, deep, and impossibly vast. The emergency lights began activating more frequently now, each one blazing to life just as I approached its position, staying illuminated for exactly 7 seconds, then dying as I passed beneath. It was as if the building was lighting my way, ensuring I could see each step of the path it had chosen for me. But why? What was at the end of this journey? And more importantly, what was I being led away from? The answer to that last question came as I reached the intersection near the side exit. Behind me, from the direction of the ballroom, I heard a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. A deep, grinding groan of metal and timber under enormous stress. I spun around, phone light wavering, and saw a sight that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Through the distant doorway of the ballroom, I could see my work lights flickering erratically. But more than that, I could see the ceiling moving. The ornate plasterwork I'd been painting just minutes earlier was sagging, bowing downward under some invisible weight. Cracks appeared in the surface, spreading like spiderwebs across the carefully restored ceiling. And then, with a roar that shook the entire building, a section of the ballroom's roof collapsed. Chunks of plaster, timber, and steel crashed down onto the exact spot where I'd been working. My ladder disappeared under a pile of debris. My paint cans exploded in bursts of white that looked like blood in the emergency lighting. If I'd stayed in the ballroom, if I hadn't followed the emergency lights down this corridor, I would have been crushed. The building had saved my life. But buildings don't save lives. Buildings don't think, don't plan, don't guide maintenance workers away from danger through choreographed sequences of emergency lighting. Do they? I stood frozen in the intersection, staring at the destruction in the distance, trying to process what had just happened. The emergency light above the side exit chose that moment to activate, its red glow painting the door in shades of blood and warning. But unlike the others, this light didn't follow the 7-second pattern. It stayed on, steady and bright, illuminating the exit sign with unmistakable meaning. Leave. Now. I didn't argue with the building's instruction. The side exit opened onto a small courtyard behind the mansion, and I burst through the door into the December night with my heart hammering and my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The cold air hit my face like a slap, and I realized I was covered in sweat despite the building's careful climate control. Behind me, the fire alarm finally activated, a piercing wail that shattered the night's silence and would bring emergency responders within minutes. But the alarm was unnecessary now. I was safe. Whatever intelligence had guided me through those corridors had completed its work. I stood in the courtyard for what felt like hours, watching as fire trucks and emergency vehicles surrounded the building. The first responders found me there, still clutching my cell phone, still trying to understand what had happened. The official investigation concluded that the roof collapse was caused by structural damage from the renovation work, a load-bearing beam that had been weakened during the installation of new electrical systems. A tragic accident that could have resulted in serious injury or death if anyone had been in the ballroom when it happened. The emergency lighting system had malfunctioned due to power fluctuations caused by the failing structure, which explained the random activations I'd observed. Everything had a rational explanation, but I know what I experienced in those corridors. I know about the pattern of lights that led me to safety, about the footsteps that weren't mine, about the breathing that filled the spaces between sounds. I know about the intelligence that guided me away from danger and saved my life. The question that haunts me isn't whether the building was alive. I'm certain it was, in some way I can't understand or explain. The question is why it chose to save me, and what it might want in return. I still work in construction, but I've never taken another job at the Meridian corporate estate. The building was repaired and opened for business 6 months later, and as far as I know, it functions normally. The emergency lighting system works exactly as designed. But sometimes late at night when I'm working alone in other buildings, I find myself listening for sounds that aren't quite right, watching for lights that pulse in patterns, waiting for that moment when the architecture around me might wake up and take notice. Because once you've been guided by something that shouldn't exist, you can never quite trust the ordinary world again. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I wonder if every building is just sleeping, waiting for the right moment to open its eyes and look around, waiting to choose who lives and who doesn't. But that's a question I hope never to have answered. Only story 14. The first thing I noticed wasn't the silence. It was how complete it felt, like the air itself had been drained of sound. I'd spent 3 months designing this house, another 6 overseeing its construction, and now, standing in my gleaming hallway with boxes stacked against walls that still smelled of fresh paint, I realized I'd never actually listened to the land itself. The modern lines of glass and steel I'd crafted seemed suddenly foreign against the backdrop of the old Thornfield estate ruins, their crumbling brick walls visible through my floor-to-ceiling windows like broken teeth against the evening sky. Mrs. Garrett, the realtor, had called it character. I'd called it opportunity, a chance to build something entirely new on ground that had been forgotten for decades. That first night, I unpacked only the essentials: a mattress for the master bedroom, basic kitchen supplies, and my camera equipment. The rest could wait. I'd photographed every stage of construction for my portfolio, documenting the transformation from overgrown lot to architectural statement. One final series of interior shots would complete the project documentation. The house felt different at night. During construction, it had buzzed with activity. Workers calling out measurements, power tools whining, radios crackling with local talk shows. Now, in the settling darkness, it breathed differently. The central hallway stretched from the front entrance to the glass doors leading to the back deck, with bedrooms and offices branching off like ribs from a spine. I'd designed it for flow, for openness, for light. At 11:17 p.m., I saw the first shadow. It moved with purpose, a vertical darkness that seemed denser than the surrounding night. I caught it in my peripheral vision as I sat at my laptop in the living room, reviewing contractor invoices. When I turned to look directly, the hallway appeared empty, bathed in the soft glow from the motion sensor lighting I'd installed throughout the house. The logical mind that had earned me an architecture degree from Virginia Tech immediately provided explanations. Fatigue from the move, unfamiliar shadows cast by the ruins through the windows, the natural settling of a new building. I returned to my screen, but concentration had evaporated like morning dew. 20 minutes later, it happened again. This time I was certain. A figure had paused at the entrance to the guest bedroom, lingering for several heartbeats before continuing toward the master suite. The motion sensors should have triggered, flooding the hallway with LED brightness, but they remained stubbornly dormant. I stood slowly, my bare feet silent on the polished concrete floors I'd selected for their industrial aesthetic. The hallway stretched ahead, empty and pristine. Yet something felt wrong with the proportions, as if the space had somehow elongated in the darkness. The distances between doorways stretched beyond their architectural specifications. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by the unfamiliar symphony of a new house, the whisper of air through vents, the subtle expansion and contraction of materials responding to temperature changes, the distant settling of the foundation. But underneath these expected sounds lurked something else, a rhythm that seemed almost like footsteps, too regular to be random house noise, too soft to be definitively identified. The second night brought mirrors. I'd positioned a large rectangular mirror in the master bathroom, its frameless design maintaining the clean lines of the space. But when I brushed my teeth before bed, the reflection showed something impossible. Behind my own image, the wall revealed rough-hewn stones and aged mortar, the kind of construction I'd seen in the Thornfield ruins during my initial site surveys. I spun around. The actual wall behind me remained exactly as it should be. Smooth drywall painted in the neutral gray I'd selected, punctuated by the modern light fixtures that had cost me a small fortune. When I turned back to the mirror, my own reflection stared back from in front of that same gray wall. I pressed my palm against the glass, feeling only the cool smoothness of the surface. No distortion, no crack, no obvious explanation for what I thought I'd seen. Perhaps the angle of the lighting had created an optical illusion, shadows playing tricks with my tired mind. But the doubt had taken root. The third night, I prepared. My camera bag sat beside my bed, telephoto lens attached to the body, settings adjusted for low-light conditions. If something was happening, whether architectural anomaly or psychological breakdown, I needed documentation. The shadow appeared at 11:43 p.m., right on schedule. This time, I was ready. The figure moved with that same deliberate pace, pausing at each doorway as if conducting some kind of inspection. I raised the camera, adjusting the ISO, and peered through the viewfinder. What I saw there made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped the expensive equipment. Instead of the empty hallway, the viewfinder revealed a corridor lined with wooden doors, their brass handles tarnished with age. Gas sconces flickered along walls of exposed brick, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with their own life. And there, moving between the pools of amber light, was not the nebulous shadow I'd been tracking, but something far worse. A serpentine length of what looked like tongue or flesh extended from the darkness near the far end of the hall, tasting the air with methodical precision. It moved with the patience of a predator, sampling each doorway before sliding forward to the next. The texture was wrong, too moist, too organic, like something that had never seen sunlight. I lowered the camera with trembling hands. The hallway was empty, modern, pristine. I raised the camera again, hands steadier now with grim determination. Through the viewfinder, brick walls, gaslight, that awful searching tongue. Without the camera, nothing. I spent the rest of the night awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was losing my mind. It would be easier to accept madness than to believe my carefully constructed reality was somehow permeable, that the past could bleed through the present like watercolors in rain. Research became my obsession. I drove to the county courthouse, spent hours in dusty record rooms, pulled blueprints and land surveys dating back to the original Thornfield construction in 1847. The colonial mansion had been built by Edmund Thornfield, a tobacco merchant who'd made his fortune before the Civil War. The family had maintained the estate for 3 generations before financial ruin forced its abandonment in the 1920s. But it was the 1898 renovation records that made my blood run cold. The documents described extensive modifications to the main hallway, including the installation of mirrors of unusual provenance and viewing devices for the master's private observations. Several servants had quit during the renovation, citing unwholesome atmospheres and the feeling of being watched by more than human eyes. There had been no deaths in the house, at least none recorded in official documents. But the servant testimonies spoke of disappearances and visitors who arrived but were never seen to leave. The language was carefully sanitized, filtered through Victorian sensibilities, but the implications crawled beneath my skin like insects. That evening I stood in my bathroom, staring at my reflection. The mirror showed only what it should. My own haggard face, dark circles under eyes that had seen too much, the gray wall behind me exactly as I'd designed it. But when I looked carefully at my reflection's eyes, I realized they weren't looking back at me. They were looking past me, focused on something behind my shoulder with an expression of growing horror. I watched my own face register fear I wasn't feeling, watched my reflection's mouth open in a silent scream while I stood perfectly calm. I didn't turn around. Something deep in my survival instincts warned me that turning would break whatever fragile barrier existed between what was and what had been. Instead, I slowly raised my camera, pointing it at the mirror. Through the viewfinder, I saw myself standing in a hallway lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a different time, a different version of the space. In some, the walls were brick and mortar. In others, elegant wallpaper-covered surfaces that held secrets. But in all of them, behind each reflection, something watched. The serpentine shape I'd glimpsed before wasn't a tongue at all. It was a periscope of sorts, an extension of something larger that existed in the spaces between spaces, using the mirrors as windows into different eras of the same location. It had been there in Edmund Thornfield's time, watching through his viewing devices. It had remained when the family abandoned the estate, patient as only inhuman things can be patient. And now I built my modern house directly over its domain. My clean lines and contemporary design, nothing more than the latest layer in a palimpsest of observation and hunger. I lowered the camera and met my reflection's terrified gaze. The thing behind me shifted, and I felt breath that wasn't windbrush the back of my neck. In the mirror, my reflection mouthed a single word: run, but my feet remained rooted to the polished concrete floor, because I finally understood the truth that my architect's mind had been desperately trying to deny. I hadn't built a house next to the ruins of the Thornfield estate. I'd built it inside them. The mirrors hadn't been showing me the past bleeding through to the present. They'd been showing me the present as it really was. My gleaming modern surfaces nothing more than a thin veneer over bones that had never stopped watching, never stopped waiting. Behind me, something ancient and patient settled into position for a long observation. And in the mirror, my reflection continued screaming,